The candle has already burned down twice tonight. You can tell by the wax pooled on the tallow dish, hardened now into a small white continent, the shape of something that was once warm and is no longer. The fire in the hearth is low. Not out. No one lets a fire go out on a night like this. But pulled back into itself, a creature conserving heat, breathing slowly. The woman near the window is not asleep. She is sitting in the particular stillness of someone who is awake by choice, or perhaps not entirely by choice, watching the darkness outside with the focused attention of a person who is waiting for something. Not anything specific, just something. The kind of waiting that does not have a name. It is Tuesday. And in the world this woman lives in, the world of roughly the year 1240, in a village in what will eventually become northern France, that fact matters more than you might think. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, please subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let me bring you into the house before we go anywhere else. Because the house is where everything begins. The house is where the fear lives, where the precautions are kept, where the logic of a medieval Tuesday makes its most intimate sense. And the house, I want you to understand from the very start, is not what most people picture when they imagine the medieval world. It is not a castle. It is not a great hall with rushes on the floor and a lord at the high table and torches blazing in iron brackets along the wall. That world exists, but it is inhabited by a very small number of people, and the sleep documentary you have wandered into tonight is not about them. This is a house for everyone else. Come inside. The door is low, lower than you expect. You have to duck your head, not because medieval people were shorter. They were on average a few inches shorter than modern adults, but not dramatically so, but because a low door is a warm door. Every gap in a medieval structure is a place where heat escapes, and heat is the most precious thing in this house. The threshold is worn smooth from years of feet. The wood of the doorframe has darkened to the colour of old tea from decades of smoke and hands and weather pressing against it. Step through. The first thing you notice is the smell. It is not unpleasant exactly, but it is dense, layered, the way a room smells when it has been lived in continuously for a very long time, by people and animals and fire all at once. There is wood smoke at the top of it, always. Beneath that, something animal. The particular warm breath smell of livestock, because in the colder months the animals come inside, the goats and the single cow, if the family is fortunate enough to have one, their body heat contributing to the warmth of the space in a calculation that is not sentiment but pure survival arithmetic. Beneath the animal smell there is something sweeter and earthier. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, lavender and rosemary and rue, the medieval equivalent of an air freshener but also a medicine cabinet and a spiritual defense system all at once. The floor is packed earth, not mud. There is a distinction, and it matters to the people who live here. Packed earth properly maintained is swept, strewn with fresh rushes when they can be had, laid with flat stones near the hearth to prevent the worst of the tracked-in mud. It is not a floor anyone would choose if they had other options, but it is a floor that has been cared for and care is visible in it. Now look up. The ceiling, such as it is, consists of the exposed underside of the roof beams, dark with smoke. There is no ceiling as a separate structure in most houses of this kind. There is just the roof, held up by wooden posts and crossbeams, and the space between the floor and the underside of the thatch or the shingles is the entirety of the interior volume. In the rafters, if the family is lucky, there are hooks for hanging things. Tools, dried meat, bundles of herbs. The hook and the beam are the medieval equivalent of a storage system. In the centre of the main room, or sometimes off to one side depending on the age and style of the structure, is the hearth, and I want to stay here for a moment because the hearth is everything in this house, in the way the sun is everything in the solar system. Everything else in the domestic arrangement orbits it. The fire is never not burning, not in winter, not in summer. The fire is the light source, the heat source, the cooking apparatus, the social centre, the spiritual anchor of the space. In many traditions, the hearth fire is not merely useful. It is a presence, a living thing, something that must be tended and kept and never, under any circumstances, deliberately extinguished. We will come back to that. The smoke from the hearth drifts upward and exits through a hole in the roof, or through the thatch itself if the structure is old. or through a rudimentary chimney if the family is prosperous and lives in a period when chimney architecture has developed sufficiently to be practical. In many medieval homes, particularly in the earlier centuries of the period, the smoke does not fully exit. It hangs in the upper third of the room in a permanent soft haze, descending further in wet weather when the thatch is damp and draws badly. This is not comfortable. The people who live here have adjusted to it the way people adjust to everything they cannot change. Their eyes are accustomed to the slight persistent sting. They have learned to sleep low where the air is cleaner. The furniture is minimal and purposeful. A table, usually a board set on trestles rather than a fixed structure, both because wood is expensive and because the flexibility of a removable table lets the space do multiple things. Benches rather than chairs in most households. Chairs are a luxury, a statement of status, something you earn or inherit. A chest or two for storing cloth, tools, the things that must be kept dry and protected. And in the corner, or along one wall, the sleeping place. In a one-room house, and many medieval homes are effectively one room, particularly for the labouring poor, the sleeping place is not a separate bedroom with a closing door. It is a section of the main space, delineated perhaps by a curtain hung from a beam, perhaps simply by the arrangement of the furniture, perhaps by nothing at all except convention and the privacy that darkness provides. The bed itself, for those who have one, is a wooden frame strung with ropes or leather thongs supporting a mattress of straw or dried grass, or in more prosperous households, a wool-stuffed pallet that is almost soft. Over this, blankets of wool, rough but warm. The warmth is the point. Everything in this house is pointed at warmth. There might be 2 rooms in a better house, or 3, a separate space for sleeping, a separate space for the animals, in the coldest months a small storage area. The wealthier the household, the more rooms, the more separation between sleeping and waking and working an animal. But even in the better houses the principle is the same. Everything serves a function. Nothing is decorative for its own sake. The beautiful things, the carved beam, the embroidered cloth hanging on the wall, the brass candlestick, if the household owns such a thing, are beautiful in the way that well-made useful things are beautiful. Their beauty is an expression of the care that went into their making, not a separate category of human concern. Now I want to ask you something before we go any further. When was the last time you sat in a room that had only one light source? Not a dim room, not a room with a single overhead bulb, but a room lit by a single flame, a candle, a fire, where the edges of the space genuinely fade into shadow, and the centre of the room is warm and luminous, and the rest is gradation into dark. Not the dramatic darkness of a power outage, which carries with it the knowledge that the lights will come back, that the darkness is temporary and bounded. The actual darkness of a night in a house, where all the light in the world is the fire on the hearth and the one tallow candle burning near the work. I ask because I think that darkness, real darkness lived in darkness, darkness that is simply the default condition of every evening, changes your relationship to the night in ways that are very difficult to understand from the outside. It is not merely a matter of being able to see less. It is a matter of the night becoming a different kind of thing entirely, something with substance and presence, something that presses against the windows and gathers in the corners and is never fully banished, only held at bay. In the medieval world, the night is not a pause between days. It is its own territory, with its own rules and its own inhabitants and its own dangers, and Tuesday night is something particular within that territory. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let me stay in this house a little longer, because there are things about its geography that matter for what we are building toward. The windows, where they exist, are small. Glass is expensive and in many periods and places essentially unavailable to ordinary households. Oiled linen stretched over a wooden frame, or a wooden shutter that closes against the weather. These are the window coverings of most medieval homes. The effect is that when the shutters are closed against the night or the cold, the interior becomes genuinely sealed. Not just dark, but insulated from the outside world in a way that creates its own psychology. You are inside. The world outside is outside. The boundary between them is maintained with some deliberateness. This matters because the world outside is not empty. The fields are out there, and the fields are cultivated, familiar, known in the daylight hours. But at night the fields become something else. The road running through the village is out there, and the road is watched over during the day but unwatched at night. The forest is out there, and in much of medieval Europe, particularly before the great clearances of the 12th and 13th centuries, the forest is very close. In some regions, the cultivated land around a village is a small clearing carved out of woodland that extends in every direction, further than any living person has walked. The forest at night is not a metaphor. It is a real place that contains real wolves and real boars and real desperate people who have left the protections of settled community for whatever reason, hunger or crime or exile, and who in the dark become a genuine threat. It contains, in the psychology of the people living adjacent to it, other things as well, things we will come to. But let us sit here a moment longer. Let the fire settle. Feel the warmth on your face and the coolness at your back and the way the shadows move when the flame shifts in the draught from the door. The woman who is not sleeping is still near the window. She has been sitting in this specific posture, still watchful, not tense exactly, but alert, for a while now. She has been doing the things she does every evening, checking the fire, making sure the embers are banked properly so they will hold through the night without needing attention, checking that the door bar is in place, checking the small vessel near the threshold where she placed a piece of iron this morning when she remembered what day it was. Iron. We will come to that too. Her husband is asleep in the bed corner. The children are asleep beside him, bundled together for warmth in the way that children in households without enough blankets have always slept, their breath rising and falling in the syncopated rhythm of deep sleep. The baby makes a small sound and stills. The woman watches the window. Not because she hears anything, because it is Tuesday. Now, here is the thing about this house, this room, this woman. She's not unusual. She's not superstitious in some special or exceptional way. She's not considered strange by her neighbours for what she believes or what precautions she takes. She's an ordinary woman in an ordinary house in the middle of what we now call the High Middle Ages, and the things she knows about Tuesday nights are things that everyone around her knows as well. They are not private fears. They are community knowledge, shared understanding, the kind of thing that mothers tell daughters and grandmothers tell granddaughters, and the priest confirms from the pulpit, and the wise woman down the road corroborates from long experience. Tuesday is dangerous. The question is why? And to answer it, we have to go back to a god who has been dead for centuries and whose name you say every single week without knowing it. Say the word Tuesday slowly. Tuesday day. The second syllable is obvious, the Old English dag, day, but the first syllable, Tues, that is the one that carries the history. That is the compressed, worn down, barely recognisable remnant of a name, a proper noun, a god. His name was Tu, or Tyr if you are Scandinavian, or Zew if you're speaking one of the early Germanic dialects. All variations on the same figure, the same divine presence, a deity whose worship was practiced across the pre-Christian Germanic world from the British Isles to the edges of what is now Scandinavia and Central Europe, a god of law and battle and the sky, one of the oldest of the northern pantheon, predating the more famous figures you have probably heard of. Tuesday, Tuesday. The naming of the days of the week is one of those pieces of history that sits right on the surface of modern life, visible every time you look at a calendar, and yet almost never noticed. We speak the names of ancient gods every single week, without pausing to think about what we are saying. Sunday is the sun's day, Monday is the moon's day, Wednesday is Woden's day, Woden being the Anglo-Saxon form of Odin, the All-Father of the Norse pantheon. Thursday is Thor's day, Friday is Freya's day, or Frigg's day, the two great female deities of the Norse world combined into a single syllable that now primarily refers to the beginning of the weekend. And Tuesday is Tuesday, the day of the one-handed war god. Now here is the thing about the naming that matters for understanding medieval fear. These days were not renamed when Christianity arrived in Northern Europe. The Church made various attempts over the centuries to replace the planetary names of the days. The Latin dies Martis, Day of Mars, became an English Tuesday not through Church influence, but through the translation of the Roman planetary week into Germanic divine equivalents. And when Christianity came to England and France and Germany and Scandinavia, the pagan names for the days persisted. The Church fought this on and off for several centuries. But words are stubborn. People kept saying Tuesday. People kept saying Wednesday. People kept saying Thursday, and eventually the church largely gave up on the naming, though not on what the names implied. Because what the names implied was that the days retained something of their divine associations, not in any official theologically sanctioned way, not in the way a priest would have framed it, but in the way that folk knowledge works, which is by absorption and accumulation rather than by argument. If Tuesday has always been Tuesday, and Tiw is a war god, and Mars is also a war god, and the Romans considered dies Martis to be ill-omened for certain activities, and your grandmother told you never to start a journey on a Tuesday, and her grandmother told her the same thing, then Tuesday carries that accumulated weight, not as doctrine, as texture, as the kind of thing you simply know. The connection between Tuesday and Mars deserves a moment of its own. When the Germanic peoples encountered the Roman planetary week, which assigned each day to a planet, and the planets were themselves associated with specific gods, they performed a fascinating act of cultural translation. They mapped their own deities onto the Roman ones, pairing the closest equivalent they could find. Mars, the Roman god of war, aggressive and dangerous and associated with bloodshed, was paired with Tiw, the Germanic god of single combat and law, and the sky, both associated with battles, both associated with the controlled violence of armed conflict, rather than the chaotic violence of chaos. But Mars, in Roman understanding, was deeply ambivalent. He was not simply the god of war as glory, he was the god of war as destruction, as risk, as the fundamental uncertainty of whether you would survive a conflict. His day, dies Martis, was considered ill-omened throughout much of the Roman world for beginning anything new, particularly anything that involved contracts, or journeys, or significant undertakings. You did not get married on Dies Martis. You did not start a voyage. You did not sign an important agreement if you could help it. This association, Mars-Tiw, Tuesday, bad omens for beginnings, did not vanish when Rome converted to Christianity. It transmuted. It went underground, or rather it went into the lived texture of folk practice, where it persisted with remarkable tenacity for well over 1,000 years. Here is the detail that I find genuinely fascinating, and that tends to stop people cold when I mention it. In large parts of medieval France, Spain and Italy, the parts of Europe where the Latin influence had been deepest, Tuesday was known by a form of the word Mardi, which is of course the direct descendant of Dies Martis. And in the same regions there is a proverb that runs, in various forms across various dialects, to the effect that Tuesday is the day you do not begin. Do not begin a journey. Do not begin a business. Do not begin a courtship. Do not begin anything that you want to succeed. The Spanish version of this proverb is perhaps the most famous surviving one. En martes ni te cases ni te embarques. On Tuesday, do not marry and do not embark. It is still said in Spain today. Not by everyone. Not as a genuine article of faith for most of the people who say it, but as a piece of folk knowledge so embedded in the culture that it has survived 500 years of modernity without disappearing. That is remarkable. That is a proverb that has outlasted the fall of Constantinople, the invention of the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the world wars, and the internet, and it is still there, still being said, still being half believed by people who would be genuinely surprised if you told them they were reciting a sentiment that Roman astrologers would have completely recognised. In England, Tuesday's ill-omened status was perhaps less codified in proverb but equally present in practice. Medieval English records, court documents, estate records, the surviving diaries and letters of people who thought to record such things, show a consistent pattern of avoidance. Weddings were rarely contracted to occur on Tuesdays. Major journeys were not begun on Tuesdays if a Wednesday or Thursday was available. Agricultural work that involved beginnings, the planting of a new crop, the first ploughing of a field, the first canning of meat for winter, was steered away from Tuesday when possible. Not always. Life does not always accommodate superstition. The harvest happens when the harvest happens, and if Tuesday falls in the middle of it, then Tuesday is when you work. But when there was a choice, Tuesday was avoided. Now let me tell you about Tiw specifically, because the character of the god matters for understanding the character of the fear. Tiw is one of the older Germanic deities, older, many scholars believe, than Odin in his developed form, a survival from an earlier layer of Proto-Germanic religious consciousness. He is the Sky Father in his most ancient form, cognate with the Latin Deus and the Greek Zeus, all descending from the same Proto-Indo-European root meaning sky, day, light. But in the Norse mythological tradition as we have it, primarily from the Icelandic sagas and the Prose Edda compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, Tiu has been reduced to a more specific role. He is the god of single combat, of dueling, of the formalized violence that resolves disputes between individuals. His most famous myth involves the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Fenrir was a creature of the end of the world, the great wolf who would swallow the sun at Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. The gods of Asgard, aware of the prophecy about Fenrir's eventual role, decided to bind him while they could. They fashioned a magical fetter called Gleipnir, made from things that do not exist. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. Gleipnir felt like silk but was stronger than any chain. But Fenrir refused to let himself be bound unless one of the gods placed a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, a guarantee that the binding was not treachery. Only two agreed to do it. He placed his right hand in the wolf's mouth. They bound Fenrir with Gleipnir, and when Fenrir found he could not break free, he bit off Tiu's hand. Tiu is the one-handed god, the god who sacrificed something irreplaceable to maintain the order of the world, the god of controlled violence, of the agreement honoured even when honouring it cost everything, of the pledge kept even at the cost of a hand. There is something I find genuinely moving in that story, even setting aside the mythological frame entirely. The idea of a god of justice and law who is also a god of sacrifice, who is also the god associated with the most dangerous day of the week. There is a coherence to that. The same force that binds the chaos of the world is also the force that reminds you, on his day, that chaos is always there, always straining at the fetter. Tuesday is dangerous not because evil enters the world on Tuesday. It is dangerous because on Tuesday, perhaps more than other days, the thinness of the barrier is made visible. The order of things, the crops growing, the animals healthy, the children sleeping safely, the fire burning on the hearth. That order is real, but it is not guaranteed. Tuesday is the day the order is reminded of what it stands against. Now here is where I want to pull back for a moment and look at this more broadly. The specific fear of Tuesday does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger medieval calendar of dangerous and auspicious days, a whole architecture of time that structures every week and every year, with a kind of map of spiritual risk and opportunity. Tuesday is one marker on that map, but there are many others. Some are universal across the Christian world of the Middle Ages. Some are local, specific to particular regions or parishes or families. Some are ancient, predating Christianity entirely, surviving into the medieval period the way Tuesday's associations with Tiu survived, through folk memory, through practice, through the accumulation of experience that says this day is different. And the calendar of dangerous days is much richer and much stranger than most people realise. I want to pause here and ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Do you have a day of the week that feels different to you? Not a logical difference, not the way Monday feels different because work begins, but something older than logic, a day that feels heavier or lighter or that carries a quality you cannot quite name, a day that seems to arrive with a particular atmosphere. I think more people would say yes to that than would admit it in polite company, and I think that response points to something real about how we experience time, not as an even flow of identical units, but as a rhythm with texture and variation, with days that feel their own way in patterns older than we know. The medieval person would understand that feeling exactly. They would say, of course, time is not flat, time has shape, and Tuesday is one of its sharpest edges. There is a document, several documents actually varying slightly in their content, surviving in manuscript form from the medieval period, copied and recopied by scribes who took them seriously enough to preserve them. Scholars call them by various names. The most common term is the Egyptian days. The Egyptian days are a list. Specifically, they are a list of the most dangerous days of the calendar year, days on which, according to the tradition that preserves them, it was unwise to begin any significant undertaking, unwise to travel, unwise to conduct business, unwise to get married, to have surgery, to make contracts, to begin a voyage, to plant crops, to build a house, to do anything you wanted to succeed. The lists vary somewhat from manuscript to manuscript. The number of days varies, the specific dates vary, but the concept is consistent across all of them, and the concept is this. Within every year there are certain days that are simply inauspicious. Not evil, not cursed, not the result of any moral failing on the part of the person who must endure them. Simply dangerous in the way that a river in flood is dangerous, or a winter storm is dangerous, impersonally, structurally, as a feature of the world. The name Egyptian days is itself a puzzle that scholars have debated for a long time. One theory holds that the name refers to the tradition's supposed origin in Egyptian astrology, the ancient Egyptian understanding of auspicious and inauspicious days, which was real and documented, and which did influence Greek and Roman and eventually medieval European practice through a long chain of transmission. Under this theory, the Egyptian days are the Western European inheritors of an astronomical and astrological tradition, going back to the banks of the Nile. Another theory holds that the name refers to the plagues of Egypt as described in the Book of Exodus. On this reading, the Egyptian days are the anniversary days of the 10 plagues, the days on which God struck Egypt with frogs and locusts and darkness and the death of the firstborn, the days on which catastrophe entered the world and the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was catastrophically breached. Neither theory fully accounts for all the evidence. The truth is probably a braiding of multiple traditions over centuries of manuscript transmission, each scribe adding what they knew, each tradition contributing to the final list. But what matters for our purposes tonight is not the academic puzzle of origin. What matters is that these lists existed, that they were taken seriously, that they were consulted and copied and preserved by people who found them useful. Monks copied them. Physicians consulted them. Farmers kept track of them. The Egyptian days were not marginal superstition in the medieval world. They were practical information. Here is one version of the list, roughly translated from a medieval Latin manuscript. In January, the 1st and 2nd days of the month. In February, the 8th and 10th. In March, the 15th and 17th. In April, the 16th and 21st. In May, the 7th and 20th. In June, the 10th and 15th. In July, the 13th and 22nd. In August, the 1st and 30th. In September, the 3rd and 21st. In October, the 3rd and 22nd. In November, the 5th and 28th. In December, the 7th and 22nd. 24 days in a year. On these days, according to the tradition, you did not let blood. This is important because bloodletting, the deliberate opening of a vein to release what medieval medicine considered an excess or imbalance of blood, was a standard medical treatment for a wide range of conditions. It was performed regularly on healthy people as a preventative measure, not just on the sick. And the physicians of the medieval period were careful about timing. They consulted the calendar, the phase of the moon, the position of the planets, and the Egyptian days before opening a vein. On an Egyptian day, you did not do it. The risk of death was too high. On Egyptian days, you did not begin a journey. You did not enter into any contract. You did not begin a course of medical treatment. You did not plant or sow. You did not, if you could help it, do anything that required the cooperation of fortune, because on these days fortune was turned away from you. Now, I want to stay with the bloodletting prohibition for a moment because it illustrates something important about how medieval people reasoned about these things. The prohibition was not arbitrary. It was not mere superstition disconnected from experience. It was connected to a coherent medical theory, Galenic medicine, the system of humours and their balance that dominated European medicine from antiquity through the early modern period, and it was connected to astrological reasoning that had its own internal logic. The moon governs moisture, and blood is moist. The planets govern the body in their various ways. Certain configurations of heavenly bodies were thought to make the blood too active, too turbulent, too likely to flow dangerously if a vein were opened. The Egyptian days, on this reasoning, were days when something in the celestial arrangement made the blood particularly susceptible to dangerous loss. Does this hold up to modern scrutiny? No. But was it unreasonable on its own terms given the state of knowledge available to the people who believed it? I do not think it was. These were people working with the best theoretical framework available to them, applying it consistently and drawing practical conclusions. The conclusions were wrong. But the process of reasoning, identifying dangerous conditions, taking precautions, adjusting behaviour to reduce risk, that process is not foreign to us. We just have different information. Now Tuesday, specifically Tuesday night, sits alongside the Egyptian days in the medieval architecture of dangerous time, but its danger is of a somewhat different character. The Egyptian days are dangerous because of celestial and cosmic alignment. Tuesday is dangerous because of what the night of Tuesday specifically calls forth, what it enables, what boundary it weakens. We will get to that. But first I want to tell you about Childemus, because Childemus is the darkest point on the medieval calendar of dangerous days, and understanding it helps you understand how the medieval mind categorized spiritual risk. Childemus falls on December 28th. In the liturgical calendar of the Western Church, December 28th commemorates the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the children of Bethlehem whom King Herod ordered massacred in his attempt to kill the infant Jesus. According to the Gospel of Matthew, when the Magi failed to return to Herod with news of the newborn king, Herod commanded that all male children in and around Bethlehem under the age of 2 be killed. Matthew presents this as the fulfillment of a prophecy from the book of Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children. The Feast of the Holy Innocents in the medieval church was not primarily a celebration. It was a commemoration of grief, of innocent suffering, of the death of children who died not for their own sins or failings, but simply because they were there, because history moved through their neighborhood, because the machinery of a tyrant's fear required them to be destroyed. This was, in the medieval understanding, a day permanently stained by catastrophic innocent death. And that stain extended forward in time in a remarkable way. Childemus, the day of the child killing, was considered the unluckiest day of the year. Not just December 28th itself, but every anniversary of Childemus throughout the year, and beyond that, every recurrence of whatever day of the week Childemus fell on in any given year. Here is how it worked in practice. If in a given year December 28th fell on a Wednesday, as which it sometimes did, then every Wednesday of that year was considered to carry something of the shadow of Childemus. Not equally dangerous to Childemus itself, but tainted, tinged, not the best day to begin things. This created a rolling calendar of partial danger that shifted from year to year, as the day of the week on which Childemus fell changed with the movement of the calendar. Some years Wednesday carried the Childemus shadow, some years it was Thursday, some years Monday. The communities that took this seriously, and many did, needed to recalculate each year which day bore the mark. There are records of English courts adjusting the scheduling of important proceedings to avoid the Childemus day of the week. There are records of royal coronations being moved when the proposed date fell on the wrong day. Edward IV of England, according to some accounts, delayed an important ceremony because the day originally chosen turned out to fall in the shadow of Childemus. The adjustment was not dramatic or publicly announced. It was simply done. The practical acknowledgement that some days were better than others for important beginnings. Now I want to talk about something that connects all of these dangerous days, the Egyptian days, Childemus, the shadow of Tuesday, and that is the concept of opening. The medieval world understood time not as a flat uniform medium in which events simply occur, but as a substance with variable porosity. Most of the time, the boundary between the ordinary world and the other world, the world of spirits and saints and demons and the dead and the various forces that move beneath the surface of visible reality, is relatively thick, relatively stable. Most days you do your work and eat your food and sleep in your bed, and nothing crosses that boundary uninvited. But on certain days the boundary thins. This is not a metaphor in the medieval understanding. It is a description of reality. On certain nights, and Tuesday night is one of them, the membrane between the worlds grows permeable, not dissolved, not absent, but permeable in a way that requires attention and precaution. What comes through when it thins? This is where we need to go further into the medieval night. But first, let me just sit here with you for a moment. There is something I want you to notice about what we are building toward, something that I think is worth naming before we go further into the darkness. The medieval person who is afraid of Tuesday night is not, in their own understanding, a fearful person. They are a careful person. There is a distinction. Fear without knowledge is paralysis. But careful attention to known dangers, the careful attention of someone who has inherited a body of practical knowledge about how the world works and what it requires of you, that is not paralysis. That is competence. The woman near the window is not cowering, she is watching. The iron near the threshold is not panic, it is preparation. The banked fire is not terror, it is skill. The medieval night is dangerous, but it is navigable, and the people who navigate it well have learned how. Let's go with them. Let us start with the noise. You have to understand the acoustic landscape of a medieval village at night before you can understand what the people in it heard and what they made of what they heard. The modern world is never quiet, not even in places that feel quiet. There is always a hum, a distant sound of traffic, the electrical noise of appliances and transformers, and the vast invisible infrastructure of the modern world. We are so accustomed to this background that silence, actual silence, feels unsettling, wrong, a sign of something missing. The medieval night had its own sounds, the fire settling in the hearth, a sound like breathing, like the patient exhalation of something large. The animals in the corner of the house, the particular sounds of sleeping cattle, the small restlessness of goats, the wind finding the gaps in the thatch, the occasional creak of the roof under its own weight. Outside in the village, other sounds. A dog somewhere in the distance, the liquid sound of the stream if you were near one, the sound of the woods when the wind moved through them, which is one of the oldest sounds in human experience and one that we have largely insulated ourselves from noticing. These sounds were known, familiar. The fire and the animals and the roof and the wind were the sounds of everything being as it should be. What people listened for was the other sounds, the ones that did not fit, the sounds that had no ordinary explanation. The sound of footsteps on a path when you knew everyone was indoors. A voice, or something like a voice, from a direction where no one should be. The sound of something at the door that was not the dog. Or, most unsettling of all, the sudden cessation of the ordinary sounds. The animals going still in that particular way animals go still when they sense something you cannot yet sense, followed by a silence that felt occupied. These were the sounds of Tuesday night. Not all of them, not every time. Most Tuesday nights were simply nights. The woman near the window would sit for an hour or two, tending the fire, watching the window, and then go to sleep with nothing having happened. And in the morning the world would be as it always was. The precautions would have worked, or nothing would have come, or the boundary would have stayed thick enough. But sometimes something would happen, and the experience of those sometimes, accumulated over generations, transmitted through family and community, and the stories told around fires that were never allowed to go out, those were the experiences that kept the precautions in place. What was out there? The medieval night was inhabited, in the shared understanding of the people who lived in it, by a population of non-human presences that were not all the same thing, that did not all behave the same way, and that required different responses depending on what you were dealing with. Let me walk you through them. The most important category, the one that structured the most fear and the most precaution, was the dead. The medieval dead were not tidily departed. They were not elsewhere in any simple sense. The Christian theology of the afterlife, which the Church worked hard to articulate and enforce, held that the dead were in one of several conditions: heaven, hell, or purgatory, the state of purgation through which most souls passed before achieving heaven. In official theology, the dead in these conditions did not walk among the living. They were gone. The business of the living world was not their concern. Folk practice disagreed. In the folk understanding of the medieval period, an understanding that coexisted sometimes uneasily with official theology, the dead retained an interest in the world they had left. Not all of them, not all the time, but under certain conditions, on certain nights, in certain situations, the dead could come back. Not in body, in most cases. The revenant, the physical corpse that walks, exists in medieval tradition, but it is the exceptional and extreme case. More commonly, the dead returned in presence, in atmosphere, in the weight of a room, in the sense that something was with you in the dark that was not one of the living. On Tuesday nights, the membrane between the living and the dead thinned. This was not merely a general belief. It had specific content. Specific types of dead were more likely to return on Tuesday nights than on others, and the most dangerous category was the recently dead who had died in a state of unfinished business. Unfinished business, in the medieval understanding, was not metaphorical, it was literal. a person who died before completing a vow they had made, a person who died with a debt unpaid, either money owed to others or wrongs committed against them for which no reparation had been made, a person who died without receiving the last rites of the church, without the priest's final blessing, without confession, without the sacrament that was understood to ease the passage of the soul through the threshold between life and death. These were the dangerous dead, not malicious necessarily, not evil, but incomplete, unfinished, still attached to the world by the threads of obligation, and those threads could pull. The precautions taken against the dangerous dead were specific and practical. The iron near the threshold was one of the oldest and most widespread protective practices in the European folk tradition. Iron, cold iron, as it was sometimes called, to distinguish it from the iron that had been worked and shaped, and therefore changed from its original nature, was understood to be inimical to spirits, including the spirits of the restless dead. You placed iron in doorways and window frames. You drove iron nails into the doorposts. In some traditions, you laid a piece of iron across the feet of a sleeping child, particularly on dangerous nights. Why iron? The theory varies depending on the source and the tradition. Some explanations point to the fact that iron is a relatively recent material in human history. Bronze and stone came before it, and the oldest spiritual traditions, predating ironworking, would naturally have regarded iron as alien, foreign, disrupting. If you want to keep away the oldest things, you use the newest materials. Others point to the association between iron and the smith's fire, the transformative fire of the forge, which has a purifying quality different from the domestic fire of the hearth. The smith was a figure of unusual spiritual status in many traditions, someone who worked with fire and transformation, who changed raw materials into something new, who operated at the boundary between the natural and the manufactured. Others simply say, we know iron works, we have always known iron works. The knowing preceded the explanation. On the bed where the children were sleeping, the family's single iron implement, a knife, a piece of worn metal, whatever they had, was placed carefully near the head of the oldest child who slept closest to the window, not ostentatiously, not with ceremony, with the same matter-of-fact attention that the modern parent gives to locking the car, checking the smoke alarm, making sure the doors are bolted. The fire was banked but not extinguished, because a fire going out on a Tuesday night was considered particularly dangerous. The fire was protective. The fire was presence. A house without fire on a Tuesday night was a house that had surrendered one of its most important defences. The herbs hung from the rafters served multiple purposes, but their protective function was real and taken seriously. Certain plants were understood to be inimical to the restless dead and to the other presences that moved through the night. Rowan was perhaps the most powerful and most widely attested. The rowan tree with its bright red berries, its association with the boundaries between worlds, was planted near doorways and carried by travellers. St. John's wort, which modern medicine has revisited for its effects on mood and depression, was in the medieval world a specific protection against night spirits. Its yellow flowers, blooming around the midsummer solstice, were dried and hung in windows and doorways as a ward. Yarrow, elderflowers, certain mosses. The precise catalogue of protective plants varies across regions and centuries, but the principle is consistent. The plant world was understood to have its own relationships with the spirit world, relationships that the careful householder could exploit. Now I want to tell you about the other inhabitants of the medieval night, because the restless dead, while the most important category, are not the only ones. There were the spirits of place. These are among the oldest presences in the European folk tradition, predating both classical mythology and Christianity, surviving into the medieval period in forms that were variously demonized, assimilated, or simply ignored by the Church. They are the inhabitants of specific locations, particular pools, particular crossroads, particular old trees, particular hills, not wanderers, not universal presences, specifically located. In the English tradition, they appear as various kinds of beings, the Hobbs and Brownies that attach themselves to particular households and would do small services if treated well and petty mischief if ignored, the will-o'-the-wisps of marshland, the moving lights that were understood to lead travellers to their deaths in bogs and are now explained by methane and phosphorus, but were experienced then as deliberate malice. The green men and wild folk of the forest edges, the presences that were neither fully human nor fully other, but something in between, something half domesticated by centuries of coexistence. These spirits of place were more active, in folk understanding, on certain nights than others, and Tuesday night, the night when the membrane thinned, was one of the nights when they were most likely to make themselves known. The crossroads deserves special attention in this context, because the crossroads is one of the central sites of spiritual activity in virtually every culture that has crossroads, and the medieval European tradition is no exception. The crossroads is a place of meeting, not just of roads, but of possibilities. 4 roads meeting means 4 directions, 4 choices, 4 potential futures. It means movement and decision, and it means, in the folk understanding of cultures across the world, from sub-Saharan Africa to pre-Christian Europe to the Americas, a point where different orders of reality intersect as easily as the roads themselves. In the medieval European tradition, the crossroads was the place where the dead might be encountered. It was the place where bargains could be made with beings who were not human. It was the place where, on certain nights, you might see something that you would carry with you for the rest of your life, a sight or an encounter that would mark you as someone who had touched the boundary of the ordinary world and not quite come back from it unchanged. The practice of burying suicides at crossroads, which persisted in some places until startlingly late, into the 18th and even 19th century, had its roots in this understanding. A person who had died by their own hand was understood to be among the most dangerous of the restless dead, their unfinished business of the most violent and urgent kind. Burying them at the crossroads served 2 purposes. First, it confused their spirit. A crossroads presents 4 choices of direction, and the lost spirit might be unable to choose and thus be kept from returning to the home it knew. Second, it placed the burial at the intersection of roads, where traffic and movement and the energy of passage would provide a kind of continuous distraction. On Tuesday nights, people avoided crossroads after dark. They are still avoided in some cultures. The Spanish still have a saying, the Germans have variants. The Scots maintained crossroads avoidance customs that were documented by folklorists in the 19th century as survivals from much earlier practice. The specific mechanism of the belief had been forgotten. The behaviour persisted. There is one more category of night presence that I want to mention, because it is perhaps the most intimate and most terrifying of them, and that is the category of beings that do not come from outside the house at all. The night hag, the old woman of the night, the mare in the Old English tradition, which gives us through Germanic intermediaries our modern word nightmare. Not the horse, the spirit, the pressing, suffocating presence that was understood to sit on the chest of sleepers and cause the particular experience of terror and immobility and breathlessness that we now recognise as sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a documented neurological phenomenon. During the REM phase of sleep, the brain paralyses the major muscle groups. This is a protective mechanism preventing you from acting out your dreams. Sometimes, at the boundary between REM sleep and waking, a person becomes conscious while this paralysis is still in effect. They are awake, or nearly awake, but cannot move. They may experience hallucinations, presences in the room, figures at the foot of the bed, the sense of weight on their chest. They feel fear, sometimes extreme fear. This experience is ancient. Every culture that has left records has records of this experience, and in the medieval world it was understood as an encounter with the nightmare, the mare who sat on your chest and pressed the breath from you. The preventive measures against the mare were specific. Iron near the bed, yes, but also sleeping on your side rather than your back, which was understood to make you more vulnerable to the mare's approach. Keeping a stone with a natural hole through it, a hagstone, a holy stone, hung above the bed or near the threshold. Reciting certain words before sleep, certain prayers or protective phrases that varied by region and tradition. And not sleeping at all if it was Tuesday night and you had reason to believe the mare was about. The woman near the window is staying awake in part because of this, not paralysed by fear, making a choice, the choice to be present and watchful on a night when watchfulness is warranted. Here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about the medieval night. The people who lived in it were not more credulous than us. They were not more primitive. They were not, as we sometimes condescendingly imagine, children in the dark who'd not yet grown up into rationality. They were people with extensive practical experience of the dark, of what happens in it, of what the body experiences at the boundary between sleep and waking. They were people who had inherited centuries of accumulated testimony about what the night contains. They organised that testimony into a framework that is not our framework, but that served many of the same purposes our framework serves. When they said the mare sits on your chest on Tuesday nights, they were describing something real, the experience of sleep paralysis, which is real. When they said the restless dead may be encountered near crossroads after dark, they were describing the particular vulnerability that comes from being alone in the dark at a place where multiple directions meet, where disorientation is possible, where the mind plays its old tricks. The medieval framework for the night was wrong in many of its specific claims, but it was not stupid. It was a working model of a real phenomenon, built from real experience, and it functioned. That is worth knowing as we go further into the night. The physician arrives at the bedside. It is not Tuesday night in this scene. It is a Monday morning, the day after a difficult night. The patient, a woman in her middle years, has been found by her household in a state of extreme agitation, weeping, shaking, unable to explain what has happened to her. She has marks on her skin that no one can account for, bruising along the inner arms, a rawness to her throat. Her eyes are sunken and her colour is poor. The physician examines her. He checks her pulse, with his fingers on her wrist measuring against his own heartbeat, noting the quality and speed of the blood's movement. He looks at her eyes. He examines her tongue. He may, in a more formal medical context, examine a sample of her urine, which medieval medicine considered a diagnostic window onto the state of the body's interior. He asks questions. What did she eat yesterday? When did she last sleep soundly? Has she been troubled recently by a dream or a vision or a presence? What night of the week was it? That last question is not irrelevant to his diagnosis. It is central. The medieval physician, trained, if he had been formally trained, in the Galenic tradition, and drawing also on the Arabic medical synthesis of Avicenna and others that had reached Western Europe through Spain and Sicily, operated with a concept of disease that is fundamentally different from ours, not in every respect, and not simply. The best medieval physicians were careful observers, and some of what they observed and recorded is recognizable as accurate even in modern terms. They documented the progress of specific diseases with the attention of people who had no way to cure most of them, and therefore put all of their effort into understanding. But the theoretical framework was different. The humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, were not metaphors in medieval medicine. They were real substances with real properties, and the balance between them determined the state of the body and the state of the mind. An excess of black bile produced melancholy, literally the condition of too much dark bile. An excess of blood produced sanguinity, warmth, excessive good spirits, and then recklessness. Phlegm in excess produced sluggishness, cold, the inability to be roused. And when the humours were disturbed, not just by physical causes but by spiritual and atmospheric ones, the body showed it. The physician looking at the woman on Monday morning is considering whether what happened to her was a medical problem or a spiritual one, and his medical framework does not treat those two categories as mutually exclusive. The body can be disturbed by the spirit can be disturbed by the body, the world outside the house can disturb both. He asks about Tuesday night. Because Tuesday night is known to be particularly associated with a certain kind of disturbance, the kind that leaves marks, the kind that produces a particular pattern of symptoms, the disrupted sleep, the agitation, the breathing difficulty, the marks on the skin that look like they might have been made by hands, small hands, cold hands. The physician has seen this before. He has a framework for it. In his framework, the disturbance has two possible causes, and his examination is designed to distinguish between them. The first is natural, a disturbance of the humours, specifically an excess of black bile, melancholic humour, which was understood to open the mind to fearful visions and to make the sleeper vulnerable to the influences of the night. The treatment for this was dietary mostly and constitutional. Foods that reduce the excess of black bile, rest, mild exercise, the avoidance of conditions that encourage melancholic humour, damp, cold, dark, isolation, sleeplessness. The second cause is supernatural, the direct intervention of a demon or a spirit, which had taken advantage of the thin boundary of Tuesday night to enter the house and disturb the sleeper. The treatment for this was religious, primarily. Prayer, the administration of holy water, the presence of a priest to bless the afflicted and the house, the burning of specific incense, the placement of religious objects in the room. The sophisticated medieval physician held both possibilities open and treated for both simultaneously. This is not inconsistency. This is the kind of dual-track thinking that is actually quite sensible when you are not certain which of two possible causes applies. Modern doctors use the same approach, treating symptoms while looking for the underlying cause. The medieval doctor treated both the body and the spirit, and prescribed both the dietary adjustment and the holy water. This dual-track approach reflects something important about the structure of medieval thinking about supernatural events. The Church, officially, had a position on demons and their activity in the world. Demons existed. This was not in question. The theological tradition, building on biblical texts and the writings of the Church Fathers, had elaborated a detailed demonology, a catalogue of demonic types, their powers, their areas of activity, their weaknesses. Demons could afflict the body, could disturb the mind, could appear as visions, could, under certain circumstances, possess a person entirely and displace their own soul from control of their body. But the Church also, paradoxically, worked to limit the claimed activity of demons in certain directions. The Church was deeply hostile to the idea that specific demons controlled specific days of the week. That Tuesday was a demon's night in any permanent structural sense ran against official theology, because official theology held that God controlled all of time, and that no day was inherently given over to demonic influence. Individual days could be more dangerous because of specific human behaviors. Fasting, prayer, and ritual on the one hand could protect a person. Sin and neglect on the other could open a person to attack. But the danger was in the human condition, not in the day itself. Folk practice disagreed again. In folk practice, certain nights were simply the nights when certain presences were active, and this was a matter of long experience rather than theological reasoning. People had noticed, over many generations, that certain kinds of disturbances happened more often on Tuesday nights. The Church's theological objection to this observation was genuine. The observation persisted anyway, because it was based on what people believed they had experienced. The tension between official church teaching and folk practice on these questions runs through the entire medieval period, and it is never fully resolved. The Church's approach varied from era to era and from bishop to bishop. Some church officials actively tried to suppress folk beliefs about dangerous nights, writing sermons and treatises explaining why these beliefs were wrong and spiritually dangerous. They gave too much power to demons. They implied that God did not fully control his creation. Others took a more pragmatic approach, incorporating the folk concerns into a Christian framework rather than fighting them directly. The wise woman down the road had her own relationship with the official church. She was not necessarily in conflict with it. She was operating in the space between official theology and lived experience, a space that the church never fully controlled and never fully relinquished. Let me tell you about the wise woman, because she is one of the central figures in the medieval community's navigation of dangerous nights, and she is consistently misrepresented in popular understanding. The wise woman, the cunning woman, the knowledge woman, the local healer and advisor, was not a witch in the dramatic sense that later centuries would construct. The dramatic witch of the early modern witch trials, the woman who had made a pact with the devil and was conducting organized supernatural rebellion against Christian society. That figure was largely a construction of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, built from a combination of theological anxiety, political manipulation, and misogyny. And the medieval wise woman was something more ordinary and more interesting. She was a repository of accumulated practical knowledge. She knew which plants healed which conditions. She knew which combinations were dangerous. She knew the folk protocols for specific situations. What to do when a child stopped sleeping soundly. What to do when the cattle were giving bad milk. What to do when someone in the house was showing signs of the particular disturbance associated with dangerous nights. Her knowledge was empirical in the way that all knowledge is empirical before it is systematized. She had learned it from observation and experience and inheritance. Some of it was accurate, some of it was not. Some of it was accurate for reasons she could not explain and would have explained wrongly if pressed, but much of it worked, in the practical sense that the people who consulted her found their situations improved. On the question of Tuesday nights, the wise woman was the primary community resource. She knew which plants to hang in the doorway, she knew which words to say before sleeping, she knew the specific configuration of iron and herb and prayer that was considered most effective against the particular presences that Tuesday nights might bring. She knew, from long experience and inherited knowledge, the difference between a disturbance that would pass on its own and one that required active intervention. And she knew the categories of the most dangerous presences in enough detail to give her neighbours specific advice. Here is the detail that I find most illuminating about how seriously Tuesday nights were taken in the medieval community. The wise woman's consultations on the day before Tuesday, on Monday afternoon after the midday meal, when people had finished their most pressing work, were the busiest of her week. Not because people brought her their ailments and agricultural problems, though they did, but because they came to ask what precautions were particularly warranted this week. Had she heard of any unusual activity in the neighbourhood? Were there any recent deaths in the community whose circumstances suggested the deceased might be among the restless? Had she seen or heard anything on last Tuesday that would give reason to take extra care this week? She held a kind of informal advisory session. The housewife came with questions about the herbs for the doorway. The farmer came with questions about his cattle. The mother of a child who had been sleeping badly came with questions about whether what her child was experiencing sounded like a natural disturbance or something more. The wise woman gave her answers carefully, not with drama, not with performance, with the practical, considered authority of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had developed good judgment. She was an expert. In the specific area of Tuesday nights and their associated dangers, she was the community expert, and the community consulted her because her expertise was real, in the same sense that a good carpenter's expertise is real, not because every piece of furniture is perfect, but because the person who's been making furniture for 30 years makes considerably better furniture than someone who has never tried. Now I want to do something a little different. I want to tell you what a really bad Tuesday night looked like from the inside. Not a night when the precautions worked and nothing happened and everyone slept safely. A night when something did happen, or was understood to have happened, and the community had to respond. Because it is in the response that you see most clearly what the fear actually was. The village is asleep, or nearly. Most households have banked their fires, placed their iron, said their prayers, and gone to bed by the second hour after sunset. It is deep winter, which means the night is long, 14 hours of darkness or more in the higher latitudes of northern Europe. The people in this village have been going to sleep early and waking early since long before the church formalised the canonical hours, and the rhythm of their nights is not our rhythm. They sleep in 2 phases, this is worth knowing. Modern sleep science has rediscovered what the medieval world practiced as a matter of course. Until roughly the Industrial Revolution, people in northern Europe commonly slept in 2 separate periods, separated by an hour or 2 of wakefulness in the middle of the night. The historian Roger E. Kirch has documented this extensively from historical sources. The references to first sleep and second sleep appear in medieval documents, in early modern diaries, in literature across several centuries. People would sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake in the small hours, lie quietly or sit by the fire or visit a neighbour, or attend to small tasks or pray or talk with their sleeping companions, and then sleep again until dawn. This is actually how human sleep works under natural light conditions. The electric light disrupted it by extending the evening so late that the first sleep phase begins much later, compressing the whole pattern into a single block. But in a medieval village in winter, with darkness falling at 4 in the afternoon and dawn coming at 8 in the morning, the 2-phase pattern was the normal pattern. People expected to wake in the middle of the night. They were not alarmed by it. What alarmed them was waking to find something wrong. The sounds that did not fit, the animals disturbed, the smell of something cold in a warm room, the sense, visceral, immediate, impossible to argue with, that something was present in the space that should not be. On the bad Tuesday nights, these things happened, and in the morning the village talked about it. The community's response to spiritual danger was communal. This sounds obvious, but I want to stay with it for a moment, because it is one of the things that is most different between the medieval experience and our own, and understanding the difference changes how you understand the fear. We are in most respects privatized in our fears, the things that frighten us in the night, the things that disturb our sleep, the experiences at the edge of consciousness that are hardest to name. These are things we tend to keep to ourselves, or share at most with the one or two people closest to us. We do not bring them to the community. We do not consult the neighborhood. We do not seek a communal response to an individual experience of fear. This is partly a product of individualism, the broadly modern and broadly Western tendency to understand experience as private first and shared second, and partly it is a product of the disenchantment of the world, as Max Weber called it, the gradual displacement of a shared supernatural framework by a secular one in which individual spiritual experiences have no official currency and no communal protocols for response. In the medieval village, neither of these tendencies was operative. Your experience on a Tuesday night was not only your experience, it was potentially information about the state of the boundary. It was evidence that might concern your neighbours. It was something the wise woman should know about, and in some circumstances, it was something that the priest should know about because the priest had his own toolkit for these situations, and some of what was out there required the church's specific tools. So when something happened on a Tuesday night, the morning after was a social event. People talked, not in the sensationalized way that modern people might imagine, not with drama or performance or the competitive anxiety of people trying to outdo each other's experiences, but in the practical, information-sharing way of people who are trying to understand whether what happened last night was an individual event or a community event, whether the disturbance was local to one house, or whether others had felt it, whether the thin boundary had let something specific through, and if so, what it was, and what that meant for the coming nights. The information that came out of these morning conversations shaped the response. If only one household had been disturbed, the response was individual. The wise woman came and assessed and recommended. The household added or adjusted its protections. The disrupted member of the household was attended to. If multiple households reported disturbances, the response scaled up. The priest was involved. The community undertook a collective protective action. The collective protective actions took various forms depending on the tradition, the period, and the specific nature of what seemed to have happened. Processions were among the most common, the priest leading a procession around the perimeter of the village, with the entire community following, chanting or praying, the priest sprinkling holy water at key points, doorways, crossroads, wells, the field boundaries. This was called a rogation in some traditions, though strictly rogation referred to the specific agricultural blessing processions of the spring, and what I'm describing here had a more protective and reactive character, but the form was similar. Movement around the perimeter of the community's space, the marking and remarking of the boundary. The logic was spatial as much as spiritual. The perimeter of the village was the edge of the community's claimed space, the line that divided the known from the unknown, the domesticated from the wild. When the boundary between the natural and the supernatural had thinned and something had come through, one response was to reinforce the spatial boundary, the physical territory that the community occupied and defended. The priest's blessing was one form of reinforcement, but there were others, older ones that the church had not fully absorbed and in some cases had not fully approved. The burning of specific plants at the perimeter was one. The plants whose smoke was considered most effective against the kind of presences associated with Tuesday nights included juniper, whose sharp piney smoke was understood to be particularly unwelcome to spirits, and certain combinations of herbs whose specific identities varied by region. In some traditions the burning was silent, a practical operation performed by the wise woman or by the men of the community with deliberate practicality. In others it was accompanied by words, protective phrases repeated by each person carrying a torch as they walked the perimeter. The wells were always part of the protective circuit. Water sources were liminal spaces, points where the underground, with all its associations with the world below, communicated with the surface world. Springs and wells were among the oldest sacred sites in pre-Christian Europe, and the Christianization of these sites was imperfect. Many were rededicated to saints, the holy well of this or that saint, whose blessing now protected the water and those who drew from it. but the folk understanding of wells as points of contact with the below persisted underneath the Christian overlay. On a bad Tuesday night, the wells needed particular attention. The specific practice of leaving offerings at wells, small objects, tokens, the kind of thing we now call wishing well coins, had its roots in this protective logic. You gave something to the well, to the presence that inhabited the water source, as a gesture of acknowledgement and appeasement. Not worship in the strict theological sense, something more like courtesy. The acknowledgement that this was a place where the ordinary rules were a little different, and that the beings who occupied the boundary between the surface world and the deep world deserved acknowledgement. The Church objected to this practice consistently throughout the medieval period. Councils and synods condemned offerings at wells and springs repeatedly, over several centuries, which is itself evidence of how persistent the practice was. You do not need to condemn a practice that has died out. The repeated condemnations are evidence of a living tradition that refused to die. Now I want to tell you about the most communal of all the protective responses, the one that required the largest number of people, and that was in many ways the most interesting expression of how the medieval community understood the relationship between human society and the forces that moved through the night. The watch. In some communities, on nights considered particularly dangerous, nights that had been preceded by a bad Tuesday, or nights that fell on specific calendar dates, or nights when accumulated evidence suggested that something was actively disturbing the community, a watch was kept. Not a watch in the military sense, not armed guards on the walls. A communal watch. A group of people, usually the older members of the community, people who had earned the right to represent the village in its relationship with the dark through their age and their knowledge, and their demonstrated steadiness in frightening situations, would gather in a central location and sit together through the dangerous hours. They did not do this silently. They talked. They told stories. Not frightening stories. The specific purpose of the watch was protective, and frightening yourselves would work against that purpose. They told the stories of the community's past encounters with Tuesday nights and other dangerous nights, not as horror stories, but as accounts of how those encounters had been navigated, how the precautions had worked, what had been learned. They told the stories of ancestors who had faced worse things and come through. The stories were a form of collective memory, a rehearsal of community knowledge, a way of reminding everyone who was part of the watch, and through them, by transmission the next day, everyone in the village, that this community had survived bad Tuesday nights before, that the precautions worked, that the boundary had been threatened and had held. They also prayed. The specific prayers for protection from the dangers of the night were part of every Christian tradition in the medieval period. Compline, the final office of the canonical hours, was specifically the prayer for the night. The prayer that acknowledged the vulnerability of sleep, the yielding of consciousness that happens every time you close your eyes and enter the darkness of dream, and asked for protection through it. The words of Compline acknowledge the terror of the night without pretending it does not exist. They ask for the specific protection of the guardian angels who are understood to watch over sleepers. The guardian angel tradition is relevant here. The guardian angel, the personal spiritual protector assigned to each individual soul at birth, was not a vague or sentimental concept in medieval theology. The guardian angel was a specific being, assigned to a specific person, whose job was real and demanding. They protected the sleeper from the spiritual dangers of the night. They accompanied the soul through the moments of vulnerability that every day contained. They were present particularly in those hours between the first sleep and the second sleep when the person was awake in the dark. The watch, the prayers, the stories, the guardian angels, the herbs in the doorway, the iron near the bed. All of these were elements of a single coherent system. A system built from centuries of experience and theological reasoning and folk wisdom, braided together into a working model of how to get through a dangerous night. It was not one thing, it was many things, held together by the community's shared commitment to surviving what the night might bring. Here is what I find genuinely moving about the watch. It is not primarily a defensive action, it is a social one. The people who kept the watch on dangerous nights were the oldest members of the community, the people who knew the most, the people who had, by virtue of long life, accumulated the most experience of dangerous nights and come through them. And they gathered together and talked through the night not because they were doing something magical, but because they were doing something human. They were keeping each other company in the dark, And the company, the warmth of being known, of being among people who shared your understanding of the world, of not being alone in the dark hours, was itself a form of protection, not supernatural protection, the most ancient and fundamental kind. Have you ever stayed up late with someone talking? Not because there was anything urgent to discuss, but because neither of you wanted to be the first to acknowledge that the night was long and the dark was real? That staying up together felt safer than going to sleep separately? The medieval watch understood something about that. The stories they told each other through the dangerous hours were not entertainment. They were the community's accumulated wisdom about how to survive, and the act of telling them together was the act of passing that survival knowledge from the people who had it to the people who would need it. The fear was real, the response was communal, and the community more often than not got through the night. Now I want to take you somewhere unexpected. To understand why Tuesday was feared, you have to understand the architecture of the week itself, not just Tuesday, the whole structure. Because the week, as we experience it, is not a natural unit of time. It is not like the day, which is marked by the sunrise and the sunset and the body's own rhythm of waking and sleeping. It is not like the month, which loosely follows the phases of the moon. It is not like the year, which follows the seasons, the agricultural cycle, the return of warmth and cold in patterns that even the earliest humans would have recognized. The week, specifically the 7-day week, is a human invention, and it is an invention that was imported into Northern Europe from somewhere else. The 7-day week is ancient, with roots in multiple cultures, in Babylonian astronomy, which organized the heavens around 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye: the Sun, the Moon, and the 5 planets then known: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Each of these 7 bodies was assigned a day, in a specific sequence determined by the periods of their orbits, and this assignment gave each day its character and its associations. This system reached Rome through Greek intermediaries, and the Romans adopted it enthusiastically. Dies Solis, day of the sun, was Sunday. Dies Lunae, day of the moon, was Monday. Dies Martis, day of Mars, was Tuesday. Dies Mercurii, day of Mercury, was Wednesday. Dies Jovis, day of Jupiter, was Thursday. Dies Veneris, day of Venus, was Friday. Dies Saturni, day of Saturn, was Saturday. When this system spread northward into the Germanic world, the Germanic peoples performed the cultural translation I mentioned before. They replaced the Roman deity names with their own divine equivalents. Mars became Tu, Mercury became Woden, Jupiter became Thor, Venus became Frigg or Freya. The Sun and Moon kept their names. Saturn, who had no obvious Germanic equivalent, kept his Latin name in English. Saturday retains the Roman god's name to this day, uniquely among the English days of the week. This translation was not arbitrary. The Germanic peoples chose their equivalents with some care, matching the domains and characters of the deities rather than just replacing one name with another. Woden, like Mercury, was associated with travel, communication, the movement between worlds. Thor, like Jupiter, was associated with thunder, kingship, the sky in its more dramatic manifestations. Tu, like Mars, was the god most directly associated with the controlled, formal violence of war, the war that has rules and outcomes, the war of single combat and oath-bound conflict. And Mars was, in Roman astrological tradition, the most consistently inauspicious of the 7 planetary powers when it came to beginning things. Let me tell you why Mars specifically had this character, because understanding it deepens everything else. In Roman astrological thought, the planets were not simply neutral forces with their own domains. They had qualities, beneficial or malefic, in the technical language of the tradition. Some planets were considered generally favourable in their influence. Jupiter, beneficent, expansive, associated with prosperity and growth. Venus, also generally beneficial, associated with love and abundance. Mercury was neutral, taking its character from whatever other influences surrounded it. Mars and Saturn were the 2 malefic planets. Their influence, when they were prominent in a person's birth chart or when their day arrived, required care, not terror. The Roman astrological tradition was sophisticated enough to understand that malefic influences could be worked with, could be mitigated, could even in specific circumstances be turned to good use. But they required acknowledgement, they required appropriate caution. Mars was the planet of conflict, of sharp instruments, of everything that cuts and wounds and pierces. The beginning of ventures on Mars's day was inauspicious, because Mars was not a force that supported the patient, cooperative, slow-building work of most human undertakings. Mars was sudden. Mars was decisive. Mars was, in its nature, oriented toward endings rather than beginnings, toward the culminating violence of a battle rather than the long preparation that preceded it. This is not a superstition that exists in isolation. It is a coherent philosophical system. You might disagree with its premises, but the reasoning within those premises is sound. If you believe that the 7 celestial powers shape human experience in identifiable ways, and if you believe that Mars's nature is sharp, sudden, oriented toward conflict and decisive endings, then of course you would avoid beginning anything on Mars's day that you want to develop slowly and come to a successful, peaceful conclusion. And when that reasoning was transmitted into the Germanic world, and Mars's day became Tuesday, it carried the same astrological logic with it. Tu was, like Mars, the god of decisive martial conflict. Not Odin's battle magic, not Thor's thunderous force, but the specific, focused, rule-bound violence of the single combat, the duel, the oath-sworn conflict between 2 individuals that ends when one of them falls. Beginning things on Tuesday meant beginning them under the influence of that energy. And that energy, however necessary for the things it was suited to, was not suited to marriages, to voyages, to new businesses, to the planting of crops, to any of the slow, patient, cooperative work of ordinary life. This was the astrological inheritance, but it was not the only layer. The folk tradition added something that pure astrology did not contain, the specific fear of Tuesday nights, not just Tuesday mornings, the fear of what the night brought. And that fear was not primarily astrological, it was something older. The oldest layer of the Tuesday night fear connects to something that predates the Roman planetary week. It connects to a category of sacred and dangerous time that anthropologists and historians of religion have found in virtually every human culture that has left records, the time when the boundary between the living and the dead is thin. Every culture seems to know, or to have known at some point, that there are times of year and times of week and times of night when this boundary weakens, not because the boundary disappears, the dead are dead in every tradition, but because the transition state in which the recently dead exist, between full departure and full arrival wherever they are going, brings them into proximity with the living in ways that require acknowledgement and care. The specific timing of this thinning varies across cultures. In Celtic tradition, Samhain, the end of October, the beginning of November, was the great thin time when the dead and the otherworldly beings moved most freely through the world of the living. This is the route through many transformations of Halloween. In Chinese tradition, the Ghost Festival in the 7th lunar month marks a period when the hungry ghosts return from their realm to wander among the living. In Mexican tradition, the Day of the Dead in early November welcomes the returning souls with offerings and celebration. These are the annual thin times, the calendar points when the membrane weakens seasonally. But there are also the weekly thin times, and Tuesday night, for the reasons we have been exploring, occupied that role in the folk tradition of medieval Northern Europe. Not the only weekly thin time, there were others, varying by region and local tradition. But one of the most consistent and most widely attested. Why Tuesday specifically? The astrological logic contributed. Mars's day was a day of force and disruption, and the disruption of the normal boundary between the dead and the living was a natural association for the day of the disrupting planet. But there is also the older pre-astrological logic of Tu himself. Tu had lost his hand to Fenrir. Tu had made a sacrifice at the boundary between the bound and the unbound, the safe and the catastrophic. Tu was himself a figure who had stood at the threshold of something terrible and paid the price of standing there. The god who had touched the wolf who would end the world. Tuesday night was the night of the one who had touched the void, the night when the sacrifice that held the world together was remembered, consciously or not, in the felt quality of the dark. This is deep mythology. It is the kind of mythology that does not announce itself as mythology. It operates as texture, as atmosphere, as the particular feeling of a Tuesday night that every person who has grown up with the folk tradition of Dangerous Tuesday knows without being able to explain. The feeling is the mythology, distilled into experience. Now I want to take you into something specific. There is a village in southern England, documented in a court record from the year 1253, where a conflict arose about a Tuesday night. I want to tell you about it, because it is one of those specific, particular pieces of evidence that makes history suddenly three-dimensional. The record describes a dispute between two neighbours, I will call them Thomas and William, using the anglicised versions of their names from the Latin record, about what happened during the night of Tuesday, the third week of Advent in the year 1252. Thomas claimed that William's goat had damaged his roof thatch during the night. William claimed that this was impossible because his goat had been properly penned. Thomas countered that the goat had escaped its pen, and that he could prove this because he had been awake during the relevant hours. He had been awake, he explained to the court, because it was a Tuesday night and because he had reason to believe the previous Tuesday had been disturbed. He was keeping watch. The court record notes this explanation without any apparent surprise or scepticism. The clerk who wrote it down did not add any marginal note indicating that the explanation was strange or required further examination. Thomas's account of why he was awake, because it was Tuesday and he was keeping watch, was treated as perfectly ordinary. This is the kind of detail that I find extraordinary in historical documents. Not the conflict over the goat, not the legal proceedings, but the casual normalness of the explanation. The clerk writing down this record was an educated man, probably a cleric of some kind, writing in Latin for an official court, and the Tuesday night watch was so completely unremarkable to him that he recorded it without comment. That is the evidence of a living practice, a practice so embedded in the community's understanding that it required no explanation in an official document. Everyone would have understood immediately why Thomas was awake on Tuesday night. It was Tuesday night. Of course he was watching. The goat for the record was found to have escaped its pen. William owed Thomas compensation for the damaged thatch, the court proceedings concluded. And somewhere in the Latin summary of a minor property dispute from 770 years ago, the Tuesday night watch is preserved in the amber of official record. Ordinary, unremarkable, simply what careful people did. Let me go deeper into the population of the medieval night because I have given you the categories and I want to give you the texture. The restless dead were the most immediate concern, but the experience of them was almost never the dramatic encounter that popular mythology suggests. People did not typically see the dead on Tuesday nights in the sense of seeing a figure, a ghost in the visual sense. The experience was more subtle and in some ways more disturbing for its subtlety. The most common reports of Tuesday night encounters with the restless dead describe not vision, but atmosphere, a change in the quality of the air in the room, a sudden coldness in a warm space that could not be explained by drafts or the fire fading, a sense of weight, of presence, of something occupying space that should be empty. Occasionally a sound, not a voice, not words, but something in the register of sound that did not fit the ordinary acoustic inventory of the room. The creak of a settling beam, but at the wrong time with the wrong character. The people who reported these experiences were not, in their own understanding, having visions or supernatural encounters in any exotic sense. They were experiencing what they had been told to expect and to watch for. The folk tradition had given them a category of experience to which they could assign these perceptions. And the category shaped the perception, the mild anxiety of the Tuesday night watch, the heightened attention to the sounds and qualities of the room, the specific awareness that this night was different. All of these things made certain kinds of ordinary perceptions more noticeable and more charged. This is not the same as saying the experiences were not real. Sleep scientists will tell you that hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, the experiences that occur at the boundary between waking and sleep, are extremely common in sleep-deprived or hypervigilant individuals. That cold feeling in a warm room is a genuine physiological experience. The sense of presence is a genuine perceptual experience. The abnormal sound is a genuine acoustic experience, or at least its effects are genuine. Whatever causes the altered auditory perception, the perception itself is real. What the medieval tradition did was give these real experiences a framework, a name, a place in a larger story. The cold feeling was the approach of a presence. The sense of weight was the mare, or a restless soul, or a spirit of place that had crossed the thinned boundary. The sound was a message, a warning, a reminder. This framework is not accurate by modern scientific standards, but it is not nothing. It is the difference between experiencing a frightening thing in complete isolation, with no language for what is happening, and experiencing the same frightening thing within a community that has names for it, protocols for managing it, wisdom accumulated about what it means and what to do. The woman near the window was not alone with her experience. She had the tradition, she had the names, she had the practices, she had in the morning the community. That companionship with a framework, the sense that what is happening to you is known, named, and survivable, is itself a form of protection, not from the cause of the experience, whatever that cause might be, from the isolation of the experience. Now let me tell you about one more category of night presence that I have been holding back, because it is the most interesting and the most human of them. In the folk tradition of medieval Northern Europe, there was a category of beings that occupied a position between the living and the dead, between the human and the inhuman. They were called by various names in various traditions. The elves, in the Old English sense of that word, which meant something very different from the pointed-eared Tolkien creation most of us now picture. The fairy, in the broader Romance tradition. The landvetter, the land spirits, in the Norse tradition, the Tylwyth Teg in Welsh, the Aussie in Irish. These beings were understood to be neither living humans, nor dead humans, nor purely divine beings. They were something else, the inhabitants of a world that existed parallel to the human world, accessible at points of contact, crossroads, springs, certain hills, certain hours of night, but otherwise invisible. Tuesday nights were among the hours when this parallel world came closest. The elf world in Old English tradition was not a place of beauty and grace. It was a place of genuine danger. Elf shot, the term for the invisible arrow that an elf might shoot at a human or their livestock causing sudden illness, was a recognised medical category in early medieval England. Physicians had treatments for it. The herbs used to treat elf shot appear in medical manuscripts, alongside treatments for fever and wound infection. This was not a fringe belief. It was standard medicine. And the elves were most active at night, particularly at certain hours of night. The elf-inhabited places, the hollow hills, the fairy rings of mushrooms in the meadow, the pools that glittered in an unusual way in moonlight, were places to be avoided after dark in general, and on Tuesday nights in particular. What is striking about the elf tradition is how seriously it was taken at every level of medieval society. This was not purely a peasant superstition. Royal courts had elf doctors. The condition of elf sickness appears in aristocratic medical records. Wealthy landowners took precautions around the elf-inhabited features of their estates. The tradition was not class stratified in the way that some folk beliefs are. And the specific vulnerability of Tuesday nights to elf activity, the idea that on Tuesday nights the hollow hills were more accessible, and the elves more likely to be abroad in the human world, was consistent across regional traditions. The old associations of Tuesday with dangerous margins, with the force that holds the world together, but at the cost of standing at its edge, extended to this category of being as well. There was a specific piece of folk practice associated with Tuesday night elves that I find particularly beautiful and strange. If you believed that something from the elf world had entered your house on a Tuesday night, not necessarily maliciously, not necessarily with intent to harm, but simply that a crossing had occurred, a visitor from the parallel world had been in your space, there was a cleansing practice. Not the defensive practices of prevention which you had already done, a restorative practice for after. You swept the house. Not just as cleaning, with intention. Moving from the inside corners of the house toward the door, taking the sweeping path that moved outward rather than inward. Speaking certain words as you swept. Some versions of the practice give these words. They are largely Christianized in the surviving records, invoking saints and asking for the house to be clean and clear and sealed against returns. The sweeping was the physical action. The words were the spiritual action. Together they were understood to complete the restoration of the household's integrity, after a Tuesday night when something had perhaps come too close. The sweeping tradition survived a long time. There are folklore records from the British Isles in the 18th and 19th century, centuries after the medieval period we have been dwelling in, that document Tuesday morning sweeping as a specific household practice distinct from ordinary cleaning, with specific rules about the direction of sweeping and the disposal of the swept material, never inside the house, always out the door and away from the threshold. By those centuries, most of the people doing it had forgotten why Tuesday specifically. They knew their grandmothers had done it on Tuesday mornings. They did it on Tuesday mornings. The practice had outlasted its explanation by 200 or 300 years. That kind of transmission is one of the things that keeps bringing me back to this material. The folk practices around Tuesday nights were not just beliefs, they were habits. And habits are more persistent than beliefs. You can be argued out of a belief. You cannot be argued out of a habit that your hands have learned. I want to spend a moment with the crossroads because the crossroads is one of the central sites of Tuesday night activity in the folk tradition, and I gave it short treatment earlier that it deserves to have expanded. The crossroads in the medieval world was a genuinely peculiar space, not just symbolically, practically. Think about what a crossroads was in a world without maps, without signage, without the navigational infrastructure that makes choosing a direction trivial. A crossroads was a decision point in the most literal sense. You were in motion, and here were 4 options, and the wrong choice had real consequences. You might walk for hours in the wrong direction before realizing your mistake. In winter, in failing light, with miles still between you and shelter, that kind of error could kill you. The crossroads was the place where you needed to know something you might not know. Which road was the right one? The knowledge that would answer that question might come from several sources. A local person who knew the roads, a direction sign where they existed, your own memory if you had travelled here before, or in extremity something else. In virtually every tradition that has crossroads, the crossroads is a place where that something else can be consulted, where special knowledge is available, where beings who know things humans do not can be petitioned or encountered. This is not a specifically medieval European idea. It appears in African traditional religion, in Latin American syncretic practice, in indigenous North American traditions. The crossroads as a site of access to other kinds of knowledge seems to be a human universal, arising independently whenever humans built roads that crossed each other. In the medieval European tradition, the crossroads at night was where you might encounter the dead who needed something. Not malicious ghosts. That was a possibility, but not the primary character of crossroads encounters in the folk record. More often, lost souls. The dead who had not completed what they needed to complete, who were still caught in the in-between, who might approach a living person at a crossroads to deliver a message, to complete a task, to ask for something that would allow them to move on. The moral character of these encounters was complex. Meeting a spirit at the crossroads was dangerous, but not necessarily bad. If you kept your composure, if you knew the right words and behaviours, if you had the knowledge to manage the encounter appropriately, it might resolve safely. The spirit might deliver its message and depart. You might be able to help it, to tell the living family member what the dead person needed to have done. The encounter might even be protective, if the spirit you encountered was one of the community's own dead who still cared about the community. But if you panicked, if you spoke the wrong words, if you were caught unprepared, then the crossroads encounter could go badly. Tuesday nights were when these encounters were most likely, and the advice of the folk tradition was consistent. Do not be at the crossroads after dark on a Tuesday, not because the crossroads was always dangerous on Tuesdays, because the probability of encounter was higher, because the membrane was thin, because the dead who needed to communicate were more likely to be present at the place where they had the best chance of contact. If you had to be at the crossroads on a Tuesday night, if some emergency required it, if you had no choice, there were protocols. Say a specific prayer as you approached. Do not look left, only straight ahead or right. Walk through without stopping. Do not acknowledge anything you hear or sense. When you have passed the crossroads, speak a specific phrase of dismissal and continue walking. Do not look back. The instruction to not look back at the crossroads is one of the most ancient pieces of protective folklore in the Western tradition. It echoes in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, where looking back is the fatal error. It echoes in the story of Lot's wife in the book of Genesis, turned to a pillar of salt for looking back at the destroying city. The prohibition on looking back is very old, older than any of the specific traditions that deploy it. What does it mean? The folk logic is clear. Looking back acknowledges what is behind you. Acknowledgement is a form of contact. If something is behind you at the crossroads, a presence that you should not be engaging with, Looking back initiates an engagement that you do not want. Keep moving. Do not initiate contact. In modern terms, we might say, do not feed the anxiety. Do not engage with the intrusive thought. Keep moving through the frightening space. The protective logic is the same even if the framework is different. The crossroads instruction, don't look back, keep moving, say the words of dismissal, is a behavioral protocol for managing anxiety in a specific location. It works whether or not there is actually a spirit at the crossroads. The instruction to not look back forces you to maintain your direction, to not slow down, to pass through the frightening space decisively rather than hovering in it. The words of dismissal give your mind something to do other than spiral into fear. The act of continuing to walk affirms to your body that you are moving away from the danger. This is cognitive behavioral intervention, delivered in the form of folk wisdom. The medieval tradition did not know that name for what it was doing, but it was doing it. Let me take you inside the physician's thinking more fully. The medieval physician arriving at a bedside after a troubled Tuesday night was working within a theoretical framework that I want you to understand not as a collection of errors to be condescended to, but as a genuine attempt to systematize a very difficult body of evidence. The evidence was this: certain people, on certain nights, experienced episodes of disturbing intensity that left physical marks, not just psychological distress, but symptoms in the body, changes in heart rate and breathing, changes in the skin, changes in sleep quality for days after a severe episode. The question was what caused these things. The Galenic framework, which the trained medieval physician had absorbed through years of education, offered a coherent answer. The body is governed by the balance of 4 humours. When the humours are in balance, health results. When they are out of balance, disease results. And the balance of the humours is not purely internal. It is affected by the world outside the body. The air, the food, the water, the seasons, the positions of the planets. All of these things affect the humours, pushing them toward or away from their ideal balance. In this framework, the specific vulnerability of sleep to disturbance made physiological sense. When you are awake, you have a degree of conscious control over your physical and mental state. You can move, you can breathe deeply, you can attend to your environment, you can take the actions that maintain your balance. When you sleep, all of that active management ceases. The body is governed entirely by its internal processes and by whatever external influences act on those processes without the mediation of consciousness. The sleeping body, in Galenic terms, was a body without its captain. The humours moved more freely. The influences of the external environment, the cold air, the influence of the moon and stars, the quality of the night itself, operated without resistance. On Tuesday nights, with the influence of Mars active, and with the specific atmospheric quality that the community had observed across many generations, the humours of susceptible individuals could be disturbed in predictable ways. The excess of black bile, melancholic humour, that produced fear and dark visions was more likely to accumulate. The balance of moisture and heat in the blood could shift in ways that made the sleeping body more vulnerable to external influences. And if demonic activity was also contributing, if a demon had taken advantage of the thinned membrane to act on the unguarded sleeping body, the physical symptoms were the same because the demon acted through the humours. It caused the excess of black bile, the shift in blood quality, the symptoms that were also the symptoms of a natural disturbance. This is why the physician could treat the condition with both dietary and spiritual remedies simultaneously without contradiction. Both address the final common pathway, the humoral disturbance in the body. Whether that disturbance originated in natural causes or demonic interference, the treatment aimed at restoring balance. The specifics of the dietary treatment for morbus martis, the Tuesday night disease, are preserved in several medieval medical texts. The principle was to reduce the excess of melancholic humour and to restore a better balance of warmth and moisture in the body. Foods associated with warmth and moisture, certain spices, certain wines, chicken broth, a recommendation that modern medicine has also periodically returned to, moderate warmth in the sleeping environment, avoidance of foods associated with cold and dryness, certain vegetables, cold water, the damp night air. The sleeping environment itself was prescribed, a warm room, away from the north-facing wall if possible, with another person nearby if the patient had previously experienced severe episodes. The physical presence of another warm body was understood to maintain the patient's humoral balance by providing warmth and moisture. In modern terms, we might say that the company reduced anxiety and promoted more restful sleep. In Galenic terms, the warm body of a companion helped maintain the patient's blood at an appropriate temperature and moisture, protecting against the black bile excess. The physician would have told the patient's household, in addition to all of this, to be sure the fire was kept burning through the night. The fire's warmth was medicine. It was also, in the spiritual framework, protection. The physician did not always separate these two functions. The fire that warmed the body was the fire that held the dark at bay. Both things were true. There is a specific medical text I want to tell you about, because it is one of the most illuminating things I have encountered in the research for this story. The Leech Book of Buld is a 10th century Old English medical manuscript, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the English language. It contains remedies for a wide range of conditions, including several that are specifically concerned with nighttime disturbances. One of the remedies in the Leech Book is titled, in translation, A Salve Against the Elfin Race and Nocturnal Visitors. It contains a list of plants, some identifiable, some not, combined in specific ways and applied to the body in a specific pattern. The preparation of the salve involves speaking certain words over the plants as they are gathered and combined. The application of the salve involves more words. What is striking about this remedy is its dual character. It is a medical remedy, a salve, applied to the skin, containing herbs with real physiological properties. Several of the identifiable plants have documented effects on the nervous system. Some of them are mild sedatives or anxiolytics. The remedy, as a medical intervention, might actually work, in the sense of producing a calmer, less anxious sleeper, who was less likely to experience the hypnagogic disturbances associated with hypervigilance. And it is a magical remedy. The words spoken over the plants, the specific pattern of application, the ritual framing of the preparation. These elements are performing the psychological function of establishing in the mind of the patient that a protective intervention has been performed. In modern terms, we would call this the placebo effect, and we would not mean that dismissively. The placebo effect is a real and documented physiological phenomenon with measurable outcomes. The ritual confidence that one has been protected produces a genuine change in the body's response to anxiety. The Leech Book remedy is both things simultaneously. It does not distinguish between them because the distinction is not available to it conceptually. The herbs work, and the words work, and the combination works through the unified mechanism of the body, responding to everything it is given. This is not primitive medicine. This is, in a specific way, rather sophisticated medicine. It treats the whole person, the body with the herbs, the mind with the ritual, the spirit with the prayer. Modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover the value of this whole person approach after 2 centuries of Cartesian division between body and mind. The Leech Book of Buld understood something that modern medicine occasionally forgets. I want to tell you about one more figure in the medieval night fear tradition before we move into the later chapters of this story. One more specific, particular, real person around whom some of the most interesting evidence about Tuesday nights clusters. Her name was approximately Elgifu. She lived in what is now southern England, in the late 11th or early 12th century. She appears in a single document, a complaint lodged with an ecclesiastical court by her neighbours about her practices. The neighbours complained that Elgifu was consulted too frequently and too openly about matters relating to dangerous nights, that she advised on Tuesday nights specifically, that her house was visited on Monday evenings by people seeking her guidance, and that this had been the practice for as long as anyone in the community could remember. The court questioned her. The record of the questioning survives in abbreviated Latin in a collection of ecclesiastical court records. She acknowledged the practices. She explained them in the recorded summary as matters of long knowledge in her family, things her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before her. She was not claiming any special divine gift or demonic compact. She was claiming expertise, inherited, practiced expertise in the specific category of knowledge concerning dangerous nights. The court debated what to do with her. The difficulty was that her practices included both elements that the Church approved of. She advised on prayer, on the use of specific saints' invocations, on the proper way to bless a house, and elements that the Church was less comfortable with, The non-Christian protective practices, the herbs and iron, the specific folk protocols that had no clear theological authorization. In the end, the court issued a warning. She was told to be more discreet. She was told to emphasize the Christian elements of her practice and to discontinue the others. Whether she complied is not recorded. What strikes me about Elgifu's case is the matter-of-factness of it on all sides. Her neighbours were not accusing her of witchcraft, not trying to have her punished for extraordinary practices. They were complaining, mildly, about the public visibility of her consultations, about the Monday evening foot traffic to her house, about the way her community role had made her something of a local institution, in a way that had become a little conspicuous. And the court was not scandalised. The ecclesiastical official who recorded the case was dealing with a common situation. The wise woman whose practices straddled the boundary between approved and unapproved, whose community function was genuine and valuable, whose methods were more traditional than the church entirely liked. It was the ordinary negotiation between official religion and folk practice that went on constantly, in every village, throughout the medieval period. Elgfu was one node in that negotiation, a real person, doing a real job, navigating the real demands of a community that needed what she knew, and a church that had mixed feelings about her knowing it. She was doing the work that needed doing, the Tuesday night work, the work that kept the community's knowledge about dangerous nights alive and available and applied. I think about her sometimes on Tuesday evenings, when the light is going and the week is turning toward its middle. There is something about knowing that this work has been done, in this specific way, for this specific purpose, for longer than I can trace, that moves me. Not to fear Tuesday, not to go looking for iron to put near the door, but to pay attention to the dark, to the hour, to whatever small watches the night might require of me. The Tuesday night tradition is not about fear. It was never only about fear. It was about attention, about care, about the specific practiced knowledge of what darkness requires and the willingness to provide it. Elgifu knew that. The woman near the window knows it, and somewhere in the transmission of all those watching nights, across all those centuries, something of that knowledge has reached us too. We have just forgotten to call it by its name. Let me take you back to the physical world one more time. There is something I have been wanting to give you since we first came into this house, and I have kept circling it without landing on it fully. It is the specific sensory quality of the medieval night. Not the fear, not the theology, not the folk protocols, just the way it felt. The way it felt to be alive in a world where the night was different from the day in ways that went far deeper than the absence of light. Start with the cold. December in Northern Europe, before central heating, before insulation in the modern sense, before the window glass that keeps the outside outside. December was cold in a way that required constant management. The cold was not a background condition you adjusted to and forgot. It was an active presence in your life, something you worked against continuously throughout every winter day and every winter night. The fire held it off, but the fire had a range. The warmth of the hearth was intense near the fire and diminished rapidly with distance. In a large room, the corners were cold even when the centre was warm. The sleeping bodies in the corner furthest from the fire were kept warm by each other, by the wool blankets, by the animal's body heat. But the air above them was cold. The breath rose in small clouds of vapour. You knew winter cold in your bones, in the way that people who have never lived in unheated spaces do not fully know it. Not dangerously cold, most people managed, but persistently, insistently cold. A cold that was always there, that you arranged your life around, that shaped every decision about where to sleep and when to move and how to dress and what to eat. The food of the winter was shaped by cold in ways both literal and practical. The canning, the salting, the smoking, the drying that the summer and autumn had produced was now being drawn down week by week. The winter diet was necessarily constrained. What had been preserved, what could be stored, what the animals produced in their diminished winter capacity. Cheese and bread and salted meat and root vegetables and dried peas and the preserved things on the shelf. It was not starvation for most households in most years, but it was not abundance. It was the practiced management of finite resources against the length of the season, always with the knowledge that spring was still months away and the stores had to last. This material context matters for understanding Tuesday nights. A woman sitting near the window in the deep cold of December, tending a fire that she cannot let go out because the household depends on it for warmth as much as light, watching stocks of preserved food that she knows have to last until April or May. This woman is not just engaged in a spiritual practice. She's embedded in a web of material necessity that gives the Tuesday night watch a different quality than it might have in a time of easy warmth and abundant food. The vulnerability is total, not just the spiritual vulnerability of Tuesday's thinned membrane, the material vulnerability of winter, of cold, of the gap between what you have and what you need to survive until spring. The fire is not only a spiritual protection, it is the difference between her children being warm and her children being cold. The herbs in the rafters are not only spiritual protection, some of them are medicine, the only medicine available in this house when illness comes. The iron near the door is not only spiritual protection, it is a knife, the household's most useful and most used tool. In this context, the Tuesday night watch is not separate from the ordinary work of keeping the household alive. It is continuous with it. The same attention she brings to the management of the winter stores and the fire and the health of the animals and the health of the children is the attention she brings to the Tuesday night. The Tuesday night is just one more thing that requires her full competence, one more thing that the household needs her to be equal to. She is equal to it, that is the whole point. I want to give you the smell of Tuesday night. Not metaphorically, actually. The specific, compound, layered smell of a medieval house in winter, late at night, when most of the household is asleep and the fire is banked and the work of the day has been done. Wood smoke is the dominant note, not the clean, outdoor smell of a campfire in fresh air. The indoor smell of wood smoke that has been building in the space for hours, settling into everything, the cloth, the hair, the food, the walls, the sleeping bodies. It is the smell of warmth and danger compressed together. Warmth because the fire is what makes the space livable. Danger because an unmanaged fire in a thatched building is catastrophic. The smoke smell carries both things. Under the smoke, the animals. 2 or 3 goats and a cow in the corner have their own particular smell, a smell of warmth and digestion and the sweet-sour quality of ruminant breath. Not unpleasant to someone who has lived with animals all her life. Familiar. The smell of livestock in a small space is the smell of winter warmth, of the body heat that the animals contribute to the room's temperature. Under the animals, the dried herbs, lavender, yes. Dried lavender tied in bundles and hung from the rafters retains its fragrance for months, diminishing but present. Rosemary, which has a sharper, more medicinal quality. Wormwood, bitter and pungent, hung in the doorway for its protective properties and its repellent quality to certain insects. Tansy, with its camphor-like sharpness. Under the herbs, the food smells of the day. Whatever was cooked in the iron pot over the fire, now cooled and put away. The specific smell of the porridge that was the morning meal, its residue still faintly present in the pot. The bread baked yesterday, its crust smell still in the air. And under all of this, the foundational smell of the house itself. Packed earth, old wood, stone, the accumulated condensation of years of living in a small space, the smell of the materials the house is made of, the smell of time. This is the smell that the woman near the window breathes on Tuesday night. Not pleasant in any deliberately designed sense, but known, completely, intimately known. Every note of it is the smell of home. Every note of it is the smell of everything she is protecting. The particular smell of your home at 3 a.m. is one of the most identity-loaded sensory experiences available to humans. We rarely encounter it deliberately, because we are usually asleep at 3 a.m. But when we are awake, when illness or anxiety or the particular demands of a Tuesday night watch have kept us up, the smell of the house in the deep hours is different from the smell of the house in the day. It is more concentrated, more intimate, less diluted by the daily trafficking of bodies and cooking smells and outdoor air. She breathes it without noticing it. It is simply the smell of being where she is. I think about that when I'm awake at 3 a.m. for one reason or another, in my own house, in my own particular version of the Tuesday night watch. The specific smell of my own home at that hour. The way it is both completely ordinary and completely its own thing, the distillation of all the time spent in this space, all the living that has happened here. The woman near the window and I are breathing different airs, in different centuries, in different worlds. But we are both awake in the deep hours, both attending to the particular quality of darkness that those hours require, both breathing the specific smell of home. There is a continuity in that. Now let me give you the sound. The sound of the medieval house in the deep hours of Tuesday night is primarily the sound of breathing. The children, the animals, the husband, all the living breath of the household in their various rhythms, making the room slightly less quiet than absolute silence. The fire adds its own breath, a slower one, the intake of air through the banked coals giving the embers a faint orange pulse. Beyond the house, the village sounds at night are the sounds of an inhabited place that has gone still without going silent. A dog, somewhere in the distance, with its particular late-night barking that is not alarm but commentary. The sound of the stream if the village has one, which is the most continuous sound of all, the sound that underlies everything, that has been there longer than any house in the village and will be there after all the houses are gone. The wind in the thatch, which is different from the wind in trees. The wind in thatch has a specific rustling quality, a dry whisper that rises and falls with the gusts, a sound that becomes part of the ambient texture of winter nights and is only noticed when it changes. When it stops, when the wind drops to nothing, the silence is suddenly a different kind of silence, sharper, more present. The sound she is listening for is the one that doesn't fit. That is the defining quality of the Tuesday night watcher's acoustic attention. Not listening for something specific, but for whatever is wrong. The monitoring function of human hearing, which continues even in sleep, and which in wakefulness is exquisitely sensitive to anomaly. The brain that processes hundreds of sounds and files them as expected, 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 and alerts immediately and urgently to the one that is not expected. In the modern world, this function is triggered by the wrong kind of silence. The absence of the electronic background hum, the car alarm on an otherwise quiet street, the specific wrong category sound of glass breaking. We live in a sound environment so saturated with human-made noise that the monitoring function for anomaly has been partly overwhelmed. In the medieval village at night, the function was not overwhelmed. The sound environment was manageable, the inventory of expected sounds was learnable and known, the anomaly when it came was unmistakable. And on Tuesday nights, the anomaly was considered more likely than on other nights. Not certain, not inevitable, but more likely. Enough more likely to warrant the specific quality of attention that the Tuesday night watch required. The light. I want to stay with the light for a moment because it is perhaps the most fundamental difference between the medieval night and the modern night, and understanding it is understanding the whole basis of the Tuesday night tradition. In the medieval house at night, the light sources are fire and candle. A single tallow candle, the cheapest and most common form of artificial light in the medieval household, produces approximately the equivalent of 1 or 2 modern watts of light. Not lumens, watts, the absolute energy output. 1 watt. A modern LED nightlight produces 5 to 7 watts. A standard bedside lamp produces 40 to 60 watts. The medieval candle is a tiny light source by modern standards. It illuminates a small circle around itself. It creates an island of visibility in a sea of near darkness. It moves and flickers with every breath of air, making the shadows move, casting shifting patterns of light and dark across the room that the eye reads as movement even when nothing is moving. The fire is brighter. A banked fire produces significantly more light than a candle, but it too flickers. It too makes the shadows move. It too creates the distinction between the lit centre and the dark edges that is the fundamental quality of pre-electric domestic light. The medieval person's eyes were adapted to this, not in a physiological sense. The human eye does not adapt to darkness over a lifetime in the way it adapts to darkness over minutes, but in an experiential sense, they were familiar with the specific quality of firelit darkness, with the way the shadows moved, with the distinction between the movement caused by the flickering flame and the movement caused by something else. That distinction was important. The woman near the window, watching the room in the firelight, was not watching in conditions where she might miss something because the light was bad. She was watching in conditions where the moving shadows were a constant feature of the visual field, and she had learned to read them the way a sailor reads the surface of the sea, not for specific features, but for the anomalous feature, the one that did not fit the known pattern. The shadows moved constantly in a firelit room. She knew what that looked like. She knew what firelit shadows moving looked like, specifically and in detail, from years of watching fires in this room and other rooms. If something moved that was not a shadow, she would know. That specific literacy of firelit darkness, the ability to read the moving light in its shadows and distinguish the expected from the unexpected, was a skill. Like every skill in her world, it had been learned through practice and was maintained by use. And the Tuesday night watch gave it regular exercise. We have no equivalent skill. Our homes are lit so thoroughly that there are no meaningful shadows for us to learn to read. We have traded the literacy of firelit darkness for the simplicity of electric light. What we gained is obvious. What we lost is this: the ability to be genuinely comfortable in the dark, to know the dark as something familiar and readable, rather than as an absence of information. The medieval night, with all its dangers and all its fears, was also a known country. The woman near the window knew the dark the way she knew her own house. She had lived in it all her life. It was not foreign to her. It was simply where Tuesday night took place. And she was in that darkness fully herself. There is a season for everything in the medieval world. Not just in the agricultural sense, the rhythm of planting and harvest that modern people can still understand even if they do not live it, but in the spiritual sense as well. The medieval year was structured by a calendar of sacred events so dense and specific that virtually every week had its character, its spiritual freight, its particular relationship to danger and safety, and the things that could happen to you. I want to take you through a year in that calendar, because understanding the full architecture of the medieval fearful year helps you understand where Tuesday fits within it. Let us start where the medieval year starts, or rather where the medieval spiritual imagination finds its most volatile threshold. Not January 1st, but the period of the winter solstice. The 12 days of Christmas from the 25th of December to the 6th of January were understood to be a period of unusual spiritual activity, not entirely unlike the Germanic pre-Christian period called Yule, which had its own calendar of spiritual danger and ritual protection. The 12 nights particularly were considered dangerous in the folk tradition across most of northern and central Europe. The nights between Christmas and Epiphany were nights when the boundaries were thin in a different way from Tuesday nights. Not primarily the boundary between the living and the dead, but the boundary between the human world and the more ancient spiritual world, the world of the great hunts and the old powers, the world that predated the Church's calendar entirely. There was a tradition, widespread across Germanic-speaking Europe, of what scholars now call the wild hunt, the procession of supernatural riders across the winter sky, led by a figure who varied by region: Odin in Scandinavia, Herne in England, various named leaders in German-speaking lands, and accompanied by a following of spirits, some of them the recently dead, some of them inhuman presences of various kinds. The wild hunt rode, in most traditions, primarily during the 12 nights, and its passage was to be avoided. Do not be outside, do not look at it, do not try to interact with it. The wild hunt is one of the oldest surviving pieces of European folk mythology. Its roots are genuinely pre-Christian, and the Church's attempts to suppress or reinterpret it across many centuries never fully succeeded. It survived, in various forms, well into the modern period. English fox hunting preserves, in diminished and domesticated form, the cultural memory of the Great Winter Hunt. The particular atmosphere of winter nights, that sense of something moving through the darkness above the clouds, something large and purposeful and indifferent to human concerns, that is the memory of the wild hunt, transformed and diluted but not entirely gone. Now, the 12 nights were not Tuesday night dangerous. They were a different kind of dangerous. They were the dangerous of the great old world asserting itself, the dangerous of the annual moment when the Christian order of time was thinnest over the older orders of the solstice. But a Tuesday that fell within the 12 nights was considered multiply dangerous. The regular Tuesday thinning of the membrane combined with the broader 12 nights thinning of the entire world's orderly boundary. Such a Tuesday required unusual precautions. The wise woman who advised on Tuesday nights had a specific protocol for 12-night Tuesdays. It is preserved partially in a 15th century English manuscript that catalogues folk practices for the purpose of identifying those that should be suppressed, one of those invaluable documents in which the Church's attempt to document and condemn practices ends up preserving them in detail. The specific protocol involved keeping every light in the house burning through the night, Not just the fire, every candle, every lamp, every flame that the household possessed. The light was the protection. The more light, the more protection. A house blazing with light on a 12-night Tuesday was a house that had taken no chances. The expense of burning every candle through a winter night was significant. Candles were not cheap, but a 12-night Tuesday was, in the folk understanding, the most dangerous night of the year. Worth the expense. The spring equinox brought a different set of concerns. The equinox was the pivot point of the year, the moment when the balance between night and day tipped toward the light half of the year. This tipping was a transition, and transitions were always spiritually vulnerable. The equinox period, roughly the fortnight centered on the equinox, was a time for protective practices, for the renewal of the protections that had been in place through the winter. This was when the priest's house blessing was typically renewed in communities that observed the practice, when the old protective herbs in the doorways were replaced with fresh ones, dried lavender from last summer's bundles exhausted and crumbled, new ones needed, when the iron near the threshold was checked, replaced if worn, repositioned with attention. The equinox renewal was a spring cleaning in the deepest sense, not just of the physical house, which was indeed cleaned as the weather improved and the longer days made the work possible, but of the spiritual house, its protections refreshed and re-established for the coming half-year. A Tuesday that fell at the equinox carried particular weight in this context. It was the day of Mars, the warrior force, arriving at the moment of the year's own renewal. Some folk traditions considered this potentially fortifying. Mars's energy could strengthen the renewal, give it martial force, make the spring protections more vigorous. Other traditions considered it complicating. Mars was a force of disruption, and the equinox was a moment of transition that needed care, and the combination of disruption and vulnerability was not comfortable. The resolution varied by region and family tradition. Some households performed their spring renewal specifically on a Tuesday equinox, deliberately harnessing Tuesday's force for the purpose. Others moved the renewal to any other day of the week, preferring to work with an energy more compatible with gentle transition. This is one of the ways in which the Tuesday tradition was not purely about fear. There was a conception of Tuesday energy that was positive in specific contexts. The force of the war god, properly directed, could be a protective force. The same energy that made Tuesday nights dangerous for the unguarded could, in ritual contexts with the right preparation and intention, be turned toward defense. This is the kind of nuance that gets lost when folk traditions are flattened into simple superstition. The medieval relationship to Tuesday was not simply, this day is bad, avoid it. It was more like, this day is powerful. Power requires care. With care, it is navigable. Without care, it is dangerous. Power that requires care, that is a much more interesting thing to inherit than mere fear. Midsummer brought the longest nights tipped short and the great fire festivals that the Church had Christianized as the feast of St. John the Baptist, but that retained in their bonfires and their rituals the character of the pre-Christian solstice celebration. The midsummer fires were lit on the night of June 23rd, the eve of St. John's Day, and their function was protective. The fire was walked around or leapt over if you were young and bold, and the smoke was directed toward the fields and the cattle. The fire's light and warmth and smoke were understood to be purifying, to drive off the pests and diseases and spiritual presences that could harm the crops and the livestock in the vulnerable growing season. The specific plant associated with midsummer protection was St. John's wort, which bloomed around this time and whose yellow flowers were gathered and hung in houses and doorways and worn by people walking through fields. We now know that St. John's wort contains hyperforin, a compound with genuine effects on mood regulation and anxiety. The medieval person who gathered it and hung it in the doorway was protecting against spiritual presences. The effect on the household's anxiety levels was pharmacological as well as ritual. Again, both things were true. Midsummer Tuesdays were considered the most potent of the year for certain categories of folk practice. Not primarily for protection, the midsummer energies were generally considered beneficent, oriented toward growth and warmth. But for the positive applications of Tuesday's force, for the resolution of disputes, for the conclusion of long-standing conflicts, for the kind of decisive action that Mars's energy supported. The folk tradition said, if you have something hard that needs doing, something that requires force and clarity and the willingness to cut through complications, a Midsummer Tuesday is the best time to do it. The harvest period brought the fears of loss and failure, the fear that the crops would not come in fully, that the winter would find the stores insufficient, that the long calculation of how much food you needed to survive until spring would come out wrong. These fears were practical, agricultural, entirely rational. They were also spiritualized in the harvest practices of every medieval European community. The harvest, like all significant beginnings and endings, had its own calendar of auspicious and inauspicious days. You did not start the harvest on a Tuesday if you had a choice. You started on a Monday, or a Wednesday, or a Thursday. The harvest was a beginning, and Mars's day was not the day for beginnings. But if Tuesday arrived in the middle of the harvest and the weather was right and the grain was ready, you did not stop. You worked, and you worked carefully, and you said the words that the wise woman had given you for working on a Tuesday during the harvest, and you kept the extra precautions in place. The precautions for working the harvest on a Tuesday included keeping iron on your person, a knife in your belt or a small piece of iron in your pocket, rather than just at the threshold of the house. The house protections were for the household when it was in the house. When you took the household out of the house and into the fields, you took the protections with you. I find this practical. The house was not the only space that needed protection. The world outside the house was the world where most of the work happened. The protections needed to be portable. And so the farmer went to the harvest with his knife at his belt, not only for cutting grain but for the reassurance it provided. The double purpose of every tool, in a world where the material and the spiritual were not separated. This thing cuts grain. This thing also keeps you safe. The autumn, the period from the harvest through to the winter, was the time of dying, not just of the crops but of the year itself. The pre-Christian calendar of Northern Europe had placed its great Feast of the Dead, the Feast of the Returning Souls, at the end of October and beginning of November, as the year moved into its dark half. The Church had placed its own feasts there, All Saints on the 1st of November, All Souls on the 2nd. The thinning of the boundary between the living and the dead, that the folk tradition associated with this period was officially acknowledged, Christianized, given a liturgical form in the masses for the dead and the prayers for the souls in purgatory. A Tuesday at the end of October was a convergence of multiple thinning forces: the regular Tuesday thinning, the annual autumnal thinning, the approach of the Great Dead Feast, the cold returning, the nights lengthening, the sense of the world drawing in. These Tuesdays at the end of October were, in the community's understanding, the most dangerous Tuesdays of the year. Not by an enormous margin. Any Tuesday was taken seriously, but these Tuesdays required more. The watch was larger, more households kept their lights burning, the wise woman's advisory sessions were more attended. And the morning after a late October Tuesday, the community came together in a different way than usual. Not just sharing accounts of disturbances, giving thanks for having come through, for the fire still burning in every hearth, for the children still sleeping safely, for the winter still outside where it belonged. The calendar of fear was also always a calendar of survival. Each dangerous time that passed successfully was evidence that the community knew what it was doing, that the precautions worked, or that fortune was with them, or that the boundary held. The accumulation of survived Tuesdays, survived 12 nights, survived autumns. That accumulation was itself a form of knowledge, a form of confidence. They were afraid, yes. They had reason to be afraid by their own lights, and by the lights of a world that was genuinely more dangerous than ours in many ways. But they were not defeated by the fear. They built knowledge around it. They built practice around it. They built community around it. And they survived the nights. That is the story, not the fear, the survival. Let me give you the prayers. I want to give you the actual words that a medieval person might have said on a Tuesday night, because the words were not vague or general. They were specific. They were addressed to specific beings. They named specific dangers. They invoked specific protections. I'm going to speak through them carefully, because I want you to feel them rather than simply understand them. The difference between reading a translation of a medieval prayer in a scholarly context and hearing that prayer spoken in the context of its original function is enormous. These were not texts, they were acts. Words said in the dark by a person holding the only candle in the room, with everything they cared about asleep around them. The night prayer that every literate medieval person knew by heart was the Salve Regina, the Hail Holy Queen. or more commonly in the vernacular tradition, the direct address to whatever saint was the household's particular patron. Each household had its saint, its specific intercessor chosen for reasons of family tradition or local custom, or a specific answered prayer that had attached that saint's name to the family permanently. But beyond the formal prayers, there were the informal ones, the spoken words of direct address that do not appear in any prayer book because they were not written down, that lived in the oral tradition, passed from mother to daughter with the same practical care that passed on the recipe for cough syrup or the protocol for a difficult birth. One form of these prayers, preserved in fragments across various late medieval and early modern sources, ran something like this, and I want to be clear that I am giving you a composite reconstruction, not a specific document, though each element I describe has specific textual evidence behind it. Saint Michael, you who stand at the threshold of heaven and cast down what should not rise, stand at my threshold tonight and cast down what should not enter. Saints of the household, whose names are known to us, be between this family and all harm this night. Mary, gate of heaven, close against what cannot enter heaven, the gate of this house. This prayer has a specific character that I find genuinely moving. It is addressed to beings understood to be real, to be present, to be personally concerned with the welfare of this specific household. Not to an abstract divine principle, to individuals, saints with histories and personalities, who had shown in their earthly lives the specific qualities that the prayer was invoking: courage, protection, the standing between. Michael the archangel, who in the book of Revelation stands between the dragon and the rest of creation. The household saints, whose specific names gave the prayer its local texture, its connection to the particular family and its particular history. Mary, whose role as the gate of heaven, the threshold, the intercessor between human and divine, made her the natural invocation for a prayer about protecting a threshold. These were not generic protections, they were specific requests to specific beings for specific help. And the people who said them genuinely believed that they were heard. I do not say this with condescension or with the qualified acknowledgement of someone humouring a belief they do not share. I say it because I think the belief itself was doing something important, and the something it was doing was real. The act of addressing a real being with your fear, naming the fear, placing it in the context of a relationship that is bigger than yourself, asking for help from something that has the capacity to help, that act is psychologically transformative, not because the being necessarily responds in the way you hope, but because the act of speaking the fear aloud, of placing it in a relational context, of asserting that you're not alone in the dark, that changes the experience of the fear from the inside. Modern therapeutic practice rediscovered this. The act of naming and contextualizing anxiety, of placing it in a narrative frame larger than the moment of terror, is among the most effective interventions available to someone experiencing acute fear. The medieval person did not have a therapist to guide them through this. They had the prayer. The prayer performed the same function. Now let me give you the words of the wise woman, or some version of them, because her contribution to the Tuesday night arsenal was different from the priest's, less formal, more specific, more attuned to the particular character of what Tuesday nights brought. The wise woman's instructions for a Tuesday night, as I can reconstruct them from the various sources that preserve fragments of this tradition, might have run something like this. Keep your fire to its full-sized flame until the second sleep. Do not bank it early. The fire is your watcher when your eyes are closed. It sees what you cannot see and keeps bright the space of the visible world. If you wake in the middle hours, do not lie still. Sit up, open your eyes to the room, see what is there. Name what you see, the fire, the children, the animals, the door, the window. Name them aloud if you have reason to worry. The naming is a holding. What is named is known. What is known is defended. If you hear something that does not fit, do not go to the door. Stay where you are. Feed the fire. Say the names of your saints. The door is barred and the iron is there and the fire is burning. You're doing everything that can be done. Trust the doing. If the animals stir, watch them. They know things before you know them. If they settle, settle with them. If they do not settle, feed the fire, say the names, and keep watching until they settle. At the cock's crow, say a word of thanks for the night's passage. This is not ceremony. It is the acknowledgement that a thing required was provided and you received it. The thanks closes the circle. The night is done when you say it is done. These instructions are practical. They are also psychological. They are also spiritual. All three things in the same words, undivided. The wise woman's instructions were not superstition. They were protocol, the protocol of a skilled person for a known difficult situation. Now I want to give you something I have been building toward through the entire length of this story. I want to give you what the woman near the window is actually thinking about in the quiet hours of the Tuesday night, not the fears, not the protocols. What comes to her mind when the work is done and the house is stable and there is nothing to do but watch and wait. Because the Tuesday night watch, for all its practical demands, is also a kind of enforced stillness. You cannot sleep, not fully, not on this night, not in these hours. You cannot work in any meaningful way. The firelight is too dim for the close work, and the sounds you would make would wake the children. You're awake, and you're still, and your hands are folded in your lap and the fire burns.
What do you do with that?
You think. Not the anxious cycling of modern worried wakefulness, the same thought 3 times and then again, the spiral without resolution. The specific clear-headed thinking of someone who has done the available work and is now simply present. The kind of thinking that is half prayer and half plain observation, that moves between the immediate world of the room and the larger world of memory and love and the permanent things. She thinks about her children. Not with worry. The worry has been addressed. The protections are in place. The children are breathing in the corner. She thinks about them with the particular quality of attention that comes when you watch someone sleeping and they do not know you are watching. You see them without the complication of their knowing they are seen. You see them as they are when no one is performing and nothing is required. The oldest child, 5 years old, has her mother's mouth. This comes to her with the always slightly surprising clarity of a thing she has noticed 100 times, and keeps noticing fresh. The child's mouth in sleep is her own mouth in a mirror, 20 years younger, with the same small upturn at one corner that her own mother used to point out, saying, "You got that from your grandmother, and I got it from mine." Something has been passed down. Something in the shape of a sleeping mouth that goes back generations, grandmother to mother to daughter to sleeping grandchild. She is one link in a chain she cannot fully trace, holding a night watch that has been held, she knows, before her by women she never knew, who understood Tuesday nights in the same way she understands them, who placed iron near the same kinds of doors and said the same kinds of prayers, and watched the same kinds of windows. This continuity is a comfort, not a dramatic comfort, a quiet one, the kind that comes from knowing you are not the first, that the work you are doing has been done before and will be done again, that you are part of something larger than your single Tuesday night in your single house in your single life. She thinks about her husband, asleep in the bed corner. He's a good man, not a complicated assessment. She's not romanticizing or performing contentment. He's simply, practically, genuinely a good man. He carries his share and more of the work. He is patient with the children in a way that some men are not. He is not afraid of Tuesday nights, or rather he is afraid of them in the ordinary way but does not let the fear become a display. When she says she will watch, he accepts it, and this acceptance is a form of respect that she has noticed and values. She thinks about the harvest just past, and whether the stores will last. This is calculation, not anxiety. She knows the numbers, the sacks of grain, the jars of preserved vegetables, the salt meat, the dried fish, the cheeses wrapped and stored. She runs through them the way a careful person runs through any inventory, looking for the gaps. She has done this calculation before. She knows what the gaps mean and how to address them. There is a gap in the smoked meat. They need more if March runs long and cold. She will speak to her neighbour about a pig share in February. 2 households sharing the cost and the work of a winter pig, each taking half the smoked meat. The calculation works. This is a practical thought, useful, the kind of thing the watch hours are good for, the quiet inventory of what is needed and how to get it. She thinks about the woman in the next village, the one who lost her husband in the summer, not to war, to a fever that moved through the village in June and took 3 people, and might have taken more if the summer had not turned hot and dry and burned the fever out of the air. The widow has 4 children and a house to manage and no one to do the things that require 2 people or a man's strength. She will go over next week after the Tuesday is done and offer what can be offered. It is not enough, it never is, but it is what there is to offer. These thoughts are not remarkable. They are the thoughts of a person who has done the necessary work of the night and is now simply thinking in the way that stillness and darkness invite. Not profound thoughts, not mystical ones. The ordinary thoughts of a person who loves her family and her community and her life and is alive in the middle of a winter night while most of the world sleeps. The Tuesday night watch gives her these hours, not as a gift exactly. The watch is a duty, not a pleasure, and she would rather be asleep. But as a byproduct, the hours of enforced stillness in which the mind can do the work it does not get to do during the busy day. In the morning she will be tired. She's always tired the morning after a Tuesday night watch. She has learned to manage this tiredness without drama, the same way she has learned to manage everything else that the week requires of her. But in the morning she will also have the particular quality that comes from a night's watch successfully kept. Not triumph. Something quieter. The knowledge that the household made it through. The knowledge that she is the reason it made it through, or at least part of the reason. The knowledge that she did the thing that the thing required. That knowledge is not nothing. That knowledge is in fact a great deal. It is the knowledge of a person who knows their own competence, who has been tested and has not been found wanting, who has stood between their family and the dark has not prevailed. Tuesday is just a day. But on Tuesday night, she is the reason Tuesday is just a day. She feeds the fire one more time. She adjusts the position of the iron near the threshold, which has shifted slightly in the night. She checks the children's breathing. She looks at the window, where the absolute dark has shifted almost imperceptibly toward the first grey hint of pre-dawn. Not yet dawn, but the direction of dawn. The night is turning. She settles back in her place. Her eyes are heavy. The second sleep is coming finally in the last hour before the household wakes. She lets it come. The fire will hold, the iron is in place, the herbs are doing their quiet work, the prayers have been said, the watch has been kept. She closes her eyes. Tuesday is nearly done. Come back to the house one last time. The snow outside is the snow that has been there all night, but the sky above it is different now, not light, not yet, but changed. The particular blue-grey of the sky in the last minutes before dawn, when the darkness has already committed to ending but the sun has not yet kept its promise. Inside, the fire is burning well, not the careful, conserved fire of the deep watch, a generous fire, a morning fire fed with the wood she's been saving since she got up a quarter of an hour ago. The room smells of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of warming air. The animals are stirring. On the threshold, the small piece of iron. In the rafters, the dried lavender. At the window, the first thread of grey light coming under the shutter. Tuesday is gone. The household is whole and warm and sleeping, and the woman who watched it through the night is at the hearth now, doing the ordinary work of the ordinary morning, her back to the window, her face to the fire. Tuesday is just a word, just another day. Except she knows what it cost. And she would do it again next week. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Did your grandmother or great-grandmother ever warn you away from something on a particular day of the week? Did she have practices around the night or around certain times of year that made no logical sense to you, but that she held on to with complete seriousness? I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. These things survive in families long after anyone remembers where they came from, and I find that extraordinary.